quiet voice in the dark, welcoming you to Phone Guy's story. Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into a different kind of Fazbear story, one that follows not an animatronic on stage, but a quiet voice on the other end of the line. The gentle, slightly nervous guide you've heard 100 times before, welcoming you to your shift, laughing off the danger, and reminding you to check those doors. As always, this is a sleep story, meant for the quiet hours when the world has dimmed and the restless thoughts of the day begin to soften. We'll move at a calm, unhurried pace, letting each detail settle, each memory unfold, until the tangled web of calls and clues becomes a single, steady timeline you can simply lie back and listen to. You do not need to keep up or remember every date and incident. You can just let the tale wash over you while your breathing slows and your eyes grow heavy. Tonight, our focus is Phone Guy. We all know his cheerful warnings and corporate-approved reassurances, the way he jokes about death in a place where death is never far away. But very few of us have followed his life, his death, and his possible afterlife as one continuous story. From his first recorded messages in the earlier, brighter days of Freddy's, through those final panic seconds on night 4, to the training tapes that echo again in Fazbear Fright, we'll trace his entire legacy step by step through the haunted shadows of this history. Across the night, we'll move from the earliest locations, where he explains grand reopening plans and mentions the bite of 87 in a voice that tries to sound casual, to the later pizzerias, and where missing children, closed-off rooms, and locked-back corridors press in around his words. We'll listen closely to each call, from night 1 to night 5, hearing how his tone changes as the tragedies mount, how his calm instructions begin to crack when the animatronics grow restless and the banging on his own door grows louder. The scope of this journey will be wide, but the telling will remain gentle. From FNAF 2's earlier training nights to FNAF 1's final scream, from corporate cover-ups to hidden recordings that resurface in FNAF 3, we'll follow an unbroken Phone Guy timeline woven quietly through the larger FNAF saga. We'll ask what he knew about the missing children, what he tried to hide about the bite of 87, and what those last, distorted seconds of audio truly reveal about the animatronic that finally reached him. Around you, imagine a low, humming ambience, the soft buzz of old wiring in the walls, the distant whir of fans and cameras, all moving slowly, predictably, never rushing, never shouting. This will not be a jump scare, but a quiet walk through haunted history, through quiet tragedies and long-forgotten training tapes, guided always by that familiar, slightly wavering voice. And it is perfectly all right if you don't stay awake to hear it all, whether you follow every moment of his story, or drift into dream somewhere between his first greeting and his final scream. The timeline will still be here, waiting, carrying his voice from beginning to end. For now, just settle in, breathe gently, and let the first ring of the phone draw us back to where his story truly begins. Our framing the entire FNAF saga around one voice. So as that first ring fades in your imagination, we're not just meeting one employee at one haunted restaurant. We're stepping back far enough to see the entire history those calls are pinned to, like little blinking lights along a very long, very dark hallway. From the earliest diners with creaking Springlock suits, to the bright but doomed children's chains of the 1980s, to underground labs and digital ghosts in the 2000s and beyond. The Five Nights at Freddy's timeline stretches quietly across decades of tragedy and technology. We begin with simple mascots in modest family diners, where Henry, Emily, and William Afton chase innocent dreams of animatronic entertainment, and we end with corrupted AR mascots and VR training tapes, where the mimic's influence and Glitchtrap's presence turn software into haunted shadows. Between those points, the story winds through missing children incidents, remnant experiments, restless spirits bound to metal, and corporate rebrands that try to bury the past while the past refuses to stay buried. It is a tangled web, and if we tried to follow every thread at once, we would never sleep. So tonight, we will do something gentler. Instead of chasing every theory and every branching possibility, we will choose one quiet line through the chaos. We will follow the sound of Phone Guy's voice. Wherever he speaks, we will pause. We will look around. We will ask what that era of Fazbear history looked like. What tragedies have already happened, and which ones are drifting slowly toward him in the dark? His messages are not all from the same week, or even the same year. The cheerful training calls of FNAF 2 belong to an earlier, more crowded restaurant, still reeling from the bite of 87 and the first wave of missing children, even as management insists that everything is fine. The worn, wary instructions of FNAF 1 belong to a later, quieter Freddy's, a place running on habit and denial. And the dry, archival training tapes we hear in a FNAF 3 echo from even further back, preserved as if the company itself cannot quite let him go. Part of our task tonight will be to take those scattered recordings, released to us out of order, and gently lay them back into their proper place on the timeline, step by step. We will listen to how his tone shifts from confident to strained, how his warnings grow more specific, how the scripted corporate reassurances begin to crack around the edges. We will notice when he mentions the bite of 87, when he hints at someone using the suits, when he brushes past the phrase tragic incidents with a little too much practiced calm. Because beneath the jokes and the chipper greetings, Phone Guy sounds like what he is. A tired, loyal employee standing at the edge of something he doesn't fully understand, caught between the company line and the quiet tragedies he's seen up close. He's trying to help us, and he's also trying to help Fazbear, and those two loyalties pull at him in the quiet hours until, one night, the animatronics reach him before his shift can end. As we move forward, we will take this slowly. Night by night, call by call, we will trace what he knew, what he chose not to say, and what finally forced its way into his cheerful script. Let the tale wash over you as we turn to his earliest surviving messages and listen for the first hints that the restaurant he loves is already haunted. A shared night shift. You, me, and everyone listening. So before we press play on that first crackling message, take a moment and imagine where you are in all of this. It is late, or it feels late, even if the clock says otherwise. Your room is dim, the screen in front of you glowing softly, not unlike a security monitor left on in a quiet office after closing time. You are at your own little desk or propped up in bed, headphones on, the outside world pushed back to the edges while we sit together in these quiet hours. The hallway beyond your door is dark. The building is still. And in that stillness, we borrow the eyes and ears of a night guard who has heard too much. As we move through this timeline, try picturing the progress bar as a row of cameras along the wall, each tiny square another part of Fazbear's long, haunted history. You glance from one to the next, drifting slowly from decade to decade, from one location's shadows to another, while Phone Guy's voice waits for us just ahead, ready to begin his cheerful script for the first time. Somewhere else, at this exact moment, someone is listening in a different room, in a different country, under a different sky. A student in a cramped apartment, the only light from a laptop on a cluttered desk. A parent lying on the couch after a long day, the hum of an old fan mixing with the audio. A night owl in a high-rise, city lights blinking like distant office cameras. The same tale, and echoing quietly through so many invisible pizzerias. And scattered across time zones, there is a small constellation of you on night shift with us. People at midnight, at 3 in the morning, at a rainy afternoon, where the clouds make it feel like evening anyway. If you feel awake enough, you can leave a gentle note in the comments, just a few words about where and when you are listening. First night, 1 a.m., small town, or final shift before sleep, storm outside the window. Together, those little fragments become a map of sleepy guards sharing one long watch. If this calm, step-by-step deep dive helps you relax, you are welcome to like the video or subscribe whenever it feels natural. There is no rush, no alarm, no urgent flashing light, only the slow unfolding of a tangled web of quiet tragedies and restless spirits, waiting patiently in the background. All of that can fade to the edges now. Let the meta talk dim like the lobby lights after closing, until it is just you, the dark, and the sound of a phone ringing somewhere down the hall. From here, we will leave our world behind and walk into his, letting the tale wash over you as we follow Phone Guy's life in universe, one call at a time, from his earliest optimism to the moment the haunted shadows finally reach his door. Let's begin. Stepping into the 1970s. Haze. Let's begin. In the quiet haze of the late 1970s, we step through the doors of a place that does not yet have a famous name, only a hopeful one. The air is warm and a little heavy, carrying the smell of dough, cheap tomato sauce, and the constant shimmer of grease that clings to every table and tile. A neon hums softly along the walls, not bright or flashy, just a low, buzzing outline that throws gentle color into the shadows where the day's noise is starting to fade. On the small stage, the first clumsy animatronics are learning how to move. They don't glide yet. They jerk and shudder, metal joints clicking as simple tracks of children's songs play on loop through worn speakers. A bare head turns a fraction too far before jerking back. A rabbit arm rises a beat late, then freezes mid-wave. To the children, they are still magical, innocent giants made of fur and metal. But to the adults watching from the back, there is already that quiet question of what happens if something goes wrong. Our story starts here, in these quiet hours after closing, when the last families have gone home and the dining room is only crumbs and reflections, and there is no phone guy yet, no cheerful voice on the line, no familiar tapes echoing through the office. But the world that will shape him is already drifting slowly into place. Somewhere in the kitchen, a manager counts the till and complains about maintenance costs. In the back hallway, a technician wipes grease from his hands and makes a note about a servo that overheated during the dinner rush. Before there was a phone guy, there were these people. Managers who worried about lawsuits and birthday bookings, technicians who stayed late to tighten bolts on machines that never really slept, night staff who learned to live with the feeling of painted eyes following them as they swept the floors. They write hand-scrawled notes about doors that stick and stage lights that flicker. They tape crude warning signs to breaker boxes, and they argue quietly about whether the animatronics should be left on free roam at night or powered down completely. Step by step, those small choices become habits, those habits become policies, and those policies begin to form the early script of a company that does not yet understand its own legacy. A manager tells a guard, "If anything seems off, just stay in the office and keep the door shut." A technician mutters, "They get quirky at night," half joking, half afraid of a machine that twitched on its own when he turned away. These are not yet the polished recorded lines we know, but you can hear the distant rhythm of them beginning. In this dim, humming space, the tangled web of future rules and cheerful warnings is already being spun. Quiet tragedies have not yet stained the carpets. Our restless spirits have not yet learned the paths between suits and shadows, but the building is learning how to breathe after dark. Somewhere in this haze, a nameless employee is listening, watching, absorbing every accident and near miss, every memo and rumor, until one day his voice will be the one we hear. And when that voice finally speaks, bright and reassuring over the crackle of a cheap phone line, it will carry all of this history inside it, including the things he will never dare to say out loud. Before the calls, early Freddy's, Henry, and Afton's shadow. All of that unspoken history has to begin somewhere, so we drift slowly back to the earliest days, before scripted calls and training tapes, before anyone thought they needed a voice to guide them through the night. In this quieter chapter of the timeline, our Freddy's is not yet a sprawling chain or a whispered urban legend. It is just an idea, taking shape in the hands of two men who do not yet understand the haunted shadows they are inviting in. Henry Emily stands at the center of that beginning, the creative mind who looks at a bare endoskeleton and sees a friendly face waiting to be painted on. He sketches bears and rabbits meant to dance under bright party lights, mascots designed to wave at innocent children and reassure nervous parents. And in his head, the stories are gentle, simple, safe. The suits and stages he builds are supposed to leave a legacy of birthday songs and shared memories, not quiet tragedies and restless spirits. Beside him, though, William Afton watches with a different kind of fascination. Where Henry sees characters, Afton sees mechanisms, and where Henry dreams of shows, Afton studies seams and joints and locks. He is drawn to the Springlock suits, to the dangerous flexibility of costumes that can be worn by a person or stand as an animatronic on stage, and he lingers on the opportunities hidden behind those smiling faces. Henry focuses on wonder and design, while Afton quietly maps out access points, blind corners, and all the little places where a child might follow a familiar mascot out of sight. The first diners that rise from their partnership are small and imperfect, more cramped family restaurant than polished entertainment complex. By day, the rooms feel almost cozy, with sticky tables, faded posters, and animatronics that sway through their routines, a little jerky, but charming enough. After closing, though, the atmosphere shifts. The lights dim, and the carpet hums with the day's spilled soda, and the characters on stage seem to stare a little too directly. Servos twitch when no one has touched the controls, heads turn a fraction off cue, and every so often a staff member swears they saw a suit move in the corner of their eye. In response to these early glitches and near misses, the first safety rules begin to appear, typed up in plain language and taped to break room walls. Do not wear the Springlock suits without proper training. Do not leave animatronics in free roam during cleaning. Always check the back rooms before locking up. These simple notes will, step by step, evolve into formal manuals, recorded messages, and the calm, practiced warnings that Phone Guy will one day recite, as if reading from a script he helped refine. Somewhere in those early locations, and among the technicians tightening bolts and the night guards walking slow circles through the dark, there is almost certainly someone already paying closer attention than most. A manager who stays late to file incident reports, a maintenance worker who keeps a private log of odd behaviors, a guard who listens to the building breathe during the quiet hours and starts to memorize every rattle and scrape. We do not know his name yet, or even if it is the same man we will hear later, but the role is already forming in the shadows. The observer, the explainer, the one who survives long enough to turn experience into advice. And as the diners expand, as policies harden after each new tragedy, that role will become a voice on the line, guiding us through a darkness that was built long before the first phone ever rang. The birth of the night guard role. And as the diners expand, as policies harden after each new tragedy, that role will become a voice on the line, guiding us through a darkness that was built long before the first phone ever rang. But before there could be a voice, there had to be a job. And before there was a job description, there was a problem no one wanted to admit they had. The animatronics were changing. What began as simple, cheerful robots on fixed tracks slowly became more advanced, more expensive, and more temperamental, their endoskeletons packed with servos and wiring that could not simply be left alone in the quiet hours. Fazbear's legacy of cheerful chaos by day created a new kind of vulnerability at night. When the lights dimmed, the last families drifted slowly out the doors, and the only things left moving were cleaning crews and the gentle twitch of cooling metal. At first, managers tried to stretch closing staff a little longer, asking a cook to lock up or a janitor to do one last walkthrough, but the building itself resisted this shortcut. There were too many corners, too many shadows behind party rooms and prize counters, too many places where an animatronic could freeze mid-step or fail to return to its proper stage. A wandering Freddy here, a twitching Bonnie there, and suddenly the company realized it needed someone whose entire purpose was to be awake when everything else was supposed to be asleep. So the night guard role emerged, quietly, almost apologetically, as a line on a schedule and a key on a ring. And the first of these guards would sit in empty dining rooms that still smelled faintly of pizza and spilled soda, listening to the low hum of refrigeration units and the soft whir of servos resetting for the next day. Their patrols became a gentle ritual. Check the back hallway, glance at the stage, make sure Foxy's curtain was closed, make sure no door was left unlocked. Routine at first, comforting even. But buildings remember their history, and Fazbear buildings especially seem to collect quiet tragedies in the walls. Early incidents began small enough to laugh off in the morning. A character found in the wrong room, a light that refused to stay on, a camera that cut to static just as something moved in the corner of the frame. A report would be filed, a supervisor would shrug, and the story would drift slowly into break room gossip, step by step though. Those stories hardened into procedures. If Chica isn't on stage, check the kitchen. If the hallway feels wrong, don't go alone. If you hear something in the vents, verify before you open anything. What began as whispered warnings became printed memos, then laminated cards, then full training materials. Somewhere in that transition, someone had the idea to record these instructions, to capture one guard's experience and play it back for the next. This is where Phone Guy's shadow first appears. He may have started as one of those early guards, or as a technician who stayed late to babysit the equipment he helped install, learning by trial and error which sounds meant normal startup, and which meant you should not be here right now. Night after night, he would normalize the abnormal, treating wandering animatronics and suspicious noises as just another checkbox on a form. Over time, that normalization hardened into the tone we later hear, casual, almost joking, as if assuring you that nothing is really wrong, even as he describes things that should never have felt normal at all. His calm instructions are the product of years spent in haunted shadows, years in which restless spirits were still being explained away as faulty pathfinding and bad wiring. And as the company leans more heavily on his recorded guidance, we move toward the moment when his voice will be everywhere, yet his fate will be sealed in a single, terrible call. Springlock dreams and nighttime nightmares. His voice spreads through the building like a quiet safety net. But behind those calm instructions lies older technology, older dreams, and older mistakes that were never fully put to rest. Before the tapes, before the nightly warnings, there was an invention that tried to be everything at once, and in doing so, quietly invited disaster into the walls. At the beginning, the idea of Springlock suits must have sounded almost elegant. One body, two purposes. In the quiet hours before opening, the metal frames would stand on their own as animatronics, performing for families, moving through pre-programmed routines beneath painted fur and friendly faces. Then, with a careful process and a trained hand, those same bodies could be emptied of their endoskeletons, the machinery folded back and held in place, so that a living employee could step inside and become the character. A single suit could walk on its own, or be worn like a costume. To a cost-conscious company, that promise was powerful. To make that possible, the engineers relied on springlocks, delicate mechanisms that compressed and pinned the endoskeleton away from the wearer. In simple terms, they were like tightly wound metal clips, holding back jaws, arms, and ribs of steel so that soft human bodies could occupy the same space without being crushed. As long as the lock stayed dry, stable, and undisturbed, the dream held together. But this was a dream balanced on needles. Moisture could make the springs slip. Sudden movement could jostle them loose. Curious hands, tampering or adjusting in the dark, could nudge a single piece out of place and let the whole structure snap back in an instant. We hear the distant echo of that design much later, drifting slowly through the training tapes of Fazbear's Fright in FNAF 3. A calm voice, so familiar to us now, explains in measured detail how to enter and exit a Springlock suit, how to avoid dampness, how to keep still when the mechanisms begin to tighten. The instructions are almost soothing, a bedtime story about staying perfectly calm while surrounded by hidden teeth. Those tapes did not appear out of nowhere. Someone had to help write them, record them, distribute them to new employees who had never seen the early tragedies firsthand. In the beginning, though, Springlock suits were not spoken of as horrors. They were clever, efficient, a way to save on storage, costumes, and maintenance. They fit neatly into Fazbear's growing legacy of doing more with less, of turning every corner of the restaurant into something that could entertain, or at least appear to. Any accidents, any early failures, it could be dismissed as rare, as user error, as the price of innovation in a family restaurant that wanted living performers and mechanical wonders sharing the same stage. Yet even in those early days, a few people would have seen the hairline cracks in the dream. a technician noticing rust where there should be shine, a manager filing one too many incident reports, and somewhere among them, a diligent employee learning every procedure, every warning, every quiet workaround, until he was the one trusted to explain it all. One day, Phone Guy's voice will calmly warn us not to breathe on the mechanisms, not to panic if the springs begin to loosen, not to touch anything we do not understand. For now, in this part of the timeline, the danger is still mostly theoretical. Mostly. But as we move step by step toward the first real Springlock failure, we begin to see how those gentle instructions will one night become a eulogy whispered in real time. The missing children and the silence in the break room, and then, almost before anyone has time to grow comfortable with those careful warnings about springs and suits, the quiet theory of danger becomes something else entirely. It stops being a memo on a bulletin board and turns into a story that people only tell in low voices, in the break room, when they are sure the manager has already gone home. We call it the missing children incident now, as if giving it a title makes it easier to file away in the company history. But in the moment, it is much simpler and much worse. A man in a familiar costume, a friendly rabbit that parents have seen on posters and in parades, offers to show a few children something special in the back. It is busy, music is playing, cameras are angled toward the stage, and no one notices right away that those innocent faces are drifting slowly out of sight, following someone they think they can trust. There is no scream we can point to, no single sharp sound that breaks the dream. Instead, there is a slow, sickening realization that the birthday table is too quiet, that a mother is standing up and looking around, that a staff member is checking the bathrooms again and again. Minutes stretch, then hours. Police are called. The building is searched, and still, the children do not come back. In the days that follow, the place feels different, even when the doors reopen. The posters remain bright, the animatronics still sing, but the air in the hallways is heavier, as if haunted shadows have settled in the corners. Employees speak in fragments. They said it was a man in a suit. They think he knew the layout. We're not supposed to talk about it. Corporate sends down carefully worded memos about cooperating with the investigation, about maintaining a positive guest experience, about not speculating in front of customers. Rules tighten quietly. Back rooms that were once left unlocked during the day now require keys and signatures. Certain hallways are no longer used for guest tours. Party attendants are told to count heads more often, to never leave a group alone, to keep the mascots away from unsupervised areas. The public story shifts gently, almost politely, and from a minor incident to an ongoing investigation, while the company does everything it can to keep the business alive, to keep the legacy of fun from collapsing under the weight of this tragedy. Somewhere in this timeline, Phone Guy steps into the picture, whether as a junior employee already sweeping floors during those restless evenings, or as a new hire brought on after the worst of the chaos has passed. Either way, he does not learn the truth from a press release. He hears it in the quiet hours, through half-finished sentences in the break room, through older staff warning him with a strained smile, not to linger near certain doors, not to trust every costume he sees. Those whispers shape him. They turn his cheerful training calls into something layered, and into a performance where he must sound optimistic while navigating a tangled web of fear, liability, and unspoken grief. When he tells a future guard that the animatronics get a bit quirky at night, it is not just a joke about wandering robots. It is a careful way of talking around something darker, around rumors that the missing children never really left, that their restless spirits might be watching from behind painted eyes. So as we let the tale wash over us and move step by step through this haunted history, we can hear, in every nervous chuckle and every corporate phrase he repeats, the echo of that first great wound to Freddy Fazbear's. The missing children incident becomes the quiet tragedy that will follow Phone Guy into every call, and it will not be the last. I'm from employee to instructor, the making of Phone Guy. That first great wound lingers in the air, and from within that wound, a voice begins to take shape. We do not meet Phone Guy as a child or as a grieving parent, but as a presence in the quiet hours, a practiced guide speaking through crackling speakers and aging phone lines, trying to make the unbearable feel routine. Before we follow his calls night by night, we need to ask who he really is in this tangled web of haunted history. The prevailing picture, drifting slowly through fan discussions and careful replays, is that Phone Guy is not an outsider at all, but a long-time employee, someone who has lived with these animatronics and their restless spirits for years. He sounds like a senior guard or a low-level manager, the kind of person who has closed up too many nights, filed too many incident reports, and watched too many quiet tragedies get folded into company policy. His tone is casual, almost friendly, but it carries the weary rhythm of someone who has told the same story many times before. There are other theories, of course. Some imagine him as a pure corporate representative, a voice recorded far away in a clean office, reading from a script and never setting foot in a security room. It is an interesting contrast, a safe distance in a story defined by proximity to danger. But when we listen closely to the games themselves, the evidence keeps pulling us back toward an on-site veteran, someone whose history is written into the walls. Phone Guy jokes about a special place in the hearts of children, and then gently about the possibility of an adult bite. He mentions the smell in the back, the way doors drain power, the habit of checking cameras in a certain order, as if these are quirks he has learned through long, anxious nights. His little asides, the nervous chuckles, the way he undercuts official reassurances with lived experience, all feel less like a spokesperson and more like a co-worker, leaning back in a chair, sharing what really happens when the lights go down. This is where a small pattern interrupt appears in the timeline. At some point, after the missing children, after complaints, after the bite of 87 is whispered about in break rooms, the company seems to decide that improvisation is too dangerous. They want standardized training. They want one voice. So they turn to the familiar presence who already knows the layout, the cameras, the rumors, and the haunted shadows that everyone pretends not to see. And in that decision, Phone Guy's role crystallizes. His friendly, gently rambling calls become the official script, a thin layer of comfort stretched over a legacy of tragedy. And as we move forward, we will follow those calls in chronological order, not from the dark, claustrophobic nights of FNAF 1, but from an earlier, brighter sounding era, where the music is livelier, the rooms feel more open, and the danger is just beginning to seep in. Next, we step by step enter the world of FNAF 2, and let the tale wash over us from his very first recorded greeting. Rewinding the tapes, why Phone Guy's timeline is out of order. We're going to do something a little unusual now. Instead of marching through the games in the order you played them, we're going to let the history itself decide the order, and we'll follow Phone Guy's voice as it drifts slowly backward through the years. In a series built on a tangled web of mixed-up menus, retro minigames, and unreliable memories, his calls are one of the quietest, clearest threads we have. Step by step, we need to accept one simple truth. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is not a sequel in the story, but a prequel. It was released after the first game, but inside the timeline, its calls come earlier, in an era when the company is expanding, experimenting, and still pretending that everything is fine. The toys are new, the rooms are brighter, the music is livelier, and behind that, Phone Guy sounds like a man at the beginning of his haunted career, not the end. Listen to his tone in FNAF 2. He's upbeat, almost cheerful, giving you confident instructions about the mask, the music box, and the old animatronics in the back. He jokes lightly about the bite of 87, as if it's an unfortunate incident, not yet a defining tragedy. And he talks about management and grand reopening plans with the weary optimism of someone who still believes the company has a future. These are the quiet hours before the worst of the bloodshed is known, when the restless spirits are already gathering, but the adults in charge are still pretending the restaurant is innocent. By the time we reach the calls from FNAF 1, the light has dimmed. The building is smaller, older, more claustrophobic, and his voice has changed to match it. He sounds strained, a little hoarse, pausing more often, repeating himself as if he's trying to reassure both you and himself. He warns you about the animatronics with a resigned familiarity, like someone who has already seen too much and is simply trying to keep the doors locked for one more week. There's less corporate optimism here, and more quiet tragedies pressed between the lines. Then, floating even further back in the timeline, we find the FNAF 3 training tapes. These instructional messages for the Springlock suits feel older still, like relics from the Fredbear's era, when the hybrid costumes were new and deadly. Whether Phone Guy recorded them personally at that time, or they were repurposed from material he once helped create. They carry the dry, official cadence of a company, trying to sound calm about something deeply unsafe. They are the haunted shadows of an earlier policy, echoing through a horror attraction decades later. So as we move forward through this story, we will not follow release dates. We will follow his life. We'll line up these scattered recordings from FNAF 3's training room, to FNAF 2's crowded, noisy office, to the lonely nights of FNAF 1, and let the tale wash over you as one continuous arc. In doing so, his choices, his fear, and finally his death will stop feeling like disconnected jump scares and start to read as a single, fragile human history. In the next section, we'll begin at that earliest point with the Springlock era and those calm, clinical tapes, and watch how the company's instructions and Phone Guy's own voice begin to bend under the weight of what's really happening behind the stage. Night 1 at the toy location. Meeting a younger Phone Guy. So now, as those early Springlock tapes fade into the background, we drift forward along the timeline to a brighter building with a darker secret, and we meet a younger version of the same familiar voice. The year is later, the technology is newer, and yet the quiet tragedies have only learned to smile. This is the so-called toy location, the second major Freddy Fazbear's we visit. With its glossy floors and pastel walls, its balloon clusters and prize counter, its rows of cameras watching every corner. The animatronics here are advertised as more advanced and more innocent, with smooth plastic faces, wide eyes, and facial recognition software tied gently into police databases, as if safety could be automated. Fazbear Entertainment is trying to rebrand after the missing children and the whispers of blood in the carpet, masking haunted shadows with brighter paint and a daycare aesthetic, while the restless spirits we've already met linger just beneath the surface. Into this space, on night 1, Phone Guy's voice arrives not as a dying man, but as a cheerful trainer. He starts with that rehearsed introduction, the cadence of someone reading from a laminated card, welcoming you to your new summer job, assuring you that Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for injury or dismemberment, yet saying it with a smile in his tone, as if legal disclaimers are simply part of the fun. We can almost hear the corporate script in the way he lists the attractions, from the music box to the prize corner, moving step by step through the features they want you to notice, not the dangers they hope you ignore. But slowly, he slips. Between the lines, he begins to drift away from the pamphlet and into something more human, more tired. And he admits that the facial recognition and criminal databases are a bit quirky, that the whole system has been acting weird, which is a gentle way of saying the dream of safety is already cracking. He mentions that the animatronics tend to wander, that they might mistake you for an endoskeleton, and you can hear the shift from sales pitch to warning, from company language to a man who has watched cameras during quiet hours and seen things move that should not move. Then come the references that tie this shiny restaurant back into the older, darker history we've already traced. He talks about the old location, almost offhand, as if it's just another store on a long corporate timeline. Yet we know it as the place of earlier murders and missing posters. He calls the withered animatronics the old characters, describes them as being kept in the back, and his voice carries a faint, uneasy respect, as though he's speaking about retired performers rather than discarded shells. In that simple contrast between toy models and withered originals, between bright stage and storage room, we feel the tangled web of legacy forming. By the end of this first call, the tone is still friendly, still light, yet there is a tiny quiver of experience under his words. A man who has already seen nights go wrong and understands that they can, quietly, go wrong again. As the line clicks off and the fan hums in the office, we're left to wonder, what did this younger phone guy already know? And what was he still trying not to admit to himself before the toys stopped behaving like toys? Night 2. Cracks in the corporate script. So when night 2 begins, and the phone rings again in that bright, remodeled office, we already listen a little differently. We've heard the cheerfulness. We've felt the practiced calm. Now, we start to notice the cracks in the corporate script. He opens with policy, with features, with what the company wants on the record. The new toy animatronics, he explains, are equipped with facial recognition software, tied directly into a criminal database, all in the name of safety and reassurance for the parents. On the surface, it sounds modern and clean, like a fresh coat of paint over a stained wall, a promise that nothing like the old tragedies could ever happen again. We're told they can detect a predator a mile away, as if advanced optics can erase haunted shadows. Listen to how he spins it. Every concerning detail is gently turned on its side, like a dangerous object being described as a helpful tool. The toys will watch everyone. The system is always scanning. The company really wants to keep things safe. He repeats that word as if it were a spell, while careful listeners can hear what lies beneath it. A restless history of missing children, police reports, and parents who never got answers. The technology is not a proud step forward in a neutral timeline. It is a bandage pressed over an old, unhealed wound. He never mentions the missing children incident by name. He never talks about bodies or suspects or the way the classic suits became vessels for restless spirits. Instead, he describes the toys' faces, their cameras, their ability to track criminals, and we can feel the invisible outline of what he is not allowed to say. Corporate wants safety optics, wants to be seen doing the right thing, while the actual ghosts of their past remain, drifting slowly, just out of frame. Then, almost casually, he lets the mask slip. He mentions that the animatronics can get a bit quirky at night, as though that were no more alarming than a squeaky hinge or a flickering light. He normalizes it with a shrug in his voice, telling you that they tend to wander, that this is just how they are, that you shouldn't worry as long as you follow the rules. In that gentle dismissal, we hear a man who has already accepted that moving characters in the quiet hours are part of the job, even when they should be powered down. Step by step, his tone shifts. The words remain instructional, but the rhythm changes, and there are slightly longer pauses, a faint edge when he talks about keeping the music box wound, about staying in one piece until morning. As we let the tale wash over us, we can sense that he is balancing two loyalties, to the truth he has witnessed in the shadows and to the company that signs his checks. Night 2 is where those loyalties first brush against each other, where the cheerful instructor's mask loosens just enough to show the worry underneath, hinting that with each passing night, it will slip a little further. Night 3, the bite of 87 and the things left unsaid. By night 3, that loosened mask does not fall off all at once. Instead, it slips in a single careful sentence that almost drifts past unnoticed. We hear him again, the same familiar cheer in his voice, and in between reminders about animatronic behavior and office routines, he drops it. A reference to one of the greatest quiet tragedies in this haunted history. He mentions it calmly, almost breezily, as if he were talking about a minor policy change rather than a life-altering event. He notes that the animatronics can be quirky, that they used to be allowed to walk around during the day, and then, with that same gentle cadence, he adds that this was after the bite of 87, a time when, as he says, it's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe. The words are clinical, nearly detached, and before we can sit with the weight of them, he has already moved on to the next instruction. There is something quietly chilling in that choice to glide past it. For him to invoke the bite at all in this late-night call, and tells us that the incident is not a secret in the way the missing children are. It is part of the restaurant's public legacy, an open wound everyone has heard about, a story that lingers in the shadows of every dining room. He speaks as though he assumes you and we have already heard the rumors, already pieced together that this place has a history of tragedy that no amount of bright paint can quite cover. Yet listen to how carefully he phrases it. He never names the victim, never states which animatronic was involved, never lingers on blood or panic or lawsuits. Instead, he reduces it to a date and a medical curiosity, as if he has been trained to talk around the pain, to acknowledge the event while draining it of emotion. It feels like the voice of someone under watchful eyes, someone who has been told exactly how much to say, and no more, by a company desperate to keep the doors open. In the broader timeline, the bite of 87 marks a turning point, a moment when the playful dream of friendly robots collides with the reality of broken bones and broken trust. After this, animatronics are chained more tightly to their stages, safety protocols multiply, And yet the restless spirits already gathering in these suits continue drifting slowly through the corridors, unbothered by policy. The bite sits between eras, before, when danger was ignored, and after, when danger was quietly normalized. And so, as we let the tale wash over us in these quiet hours, we notice what is present in his words and what is missing. If he can mention something as enormous as the bite with that light, almost offhand tone, what heavier secrets never reached the tape at all, are left to echo only in the haunted shadows of his own memory, waiting for a later night to surface. Night 4, when the jokes start to sound nervous. By the time we reach night 4 of the second game, the mask of effortlessness has slipped just enough for us to notice, and the familiar voice that once floated through the line like background noise begins to sound like someone talking himself through a storm. We are still drifting slowly through the same quiet hours, the same office, the same restless shadows at the end of a forgotten hallway, but the rhythm of his words has changed. On this night, he still opens with that practiced workday cheer, yet the jokes feel narrower, more strained, as if he is reaching for the same old script and finding less and less comfort in it. And when he brushes off the animatronic's behavior with a light remark, there is a tiny pause, a breath that lingers just a moment too long, and you can almost hear him decide to keep pretending this is all manageable. The humor is still there, but now it sounds like a bandage, not a blanket. He mentions that the animatronics have been acting a bit unpredictable, and he folds that danger into practical tips, as though any threat can be turned into a training note. Use the Freddy mask quickly when they appear. Keep an eye on the vents. Learn each of their tells. Step by step, he turns chaos into a checklist. In his voice, we can hear the company line, "This is fine. This is under control." Pressed up against a quieter truth, that the building itself is slipping into a pattern of nightly unrest that no policy can quite contain. His advice grows more specific now, less like a general orientation, and more like someone relaying hard-earned survival habits. He does not speak in vague warnings. He talks about what to do when one particular face is at the door, when certain footsteps echo too close, when the music box's gentle lullaby falters. That precision implies recent incidents, things he has either seen with his own eyes or heard in shaken reports from guards who did not last as long as you have. The timeline of quiet tragedies is catching up to him, and yet, through all of this, he keeps the same friendly tone, the same almost breezy cadence, as if he believes that sounding calm might make the night itself settle down. It is the voice of someone who has learned that fear spreads through a building faster than any rumor. So he dampens his own, by smoothing it into something you can fall asleep to if you forget to listen too closely. We can imagine him in some back office or at home, the lights low, listening to the same distant thuds and metallic shuffles you hear in-game, sharing your haunted soundscape from a safer room that does not feel quite safe anymore. Perhaps he watches the clock with you, wondering how long this can go on, how many more nights he can keep threading this tangled web of reassurance and omission before the legacy of all these restless spirits finally reaches his side of the line, and the recordings become the only part of him that remains. As we move toward his later calls, that possibility grows nearer, waiting just beyond the dial tone. Night 5 and beyond, a veteran guard's thin smile. And as we move toward his later calls, and that possibility grows nearer, waiting just beyond the dial tone, we arrive at what feels like a crest in the wave of his early career. Night 5 at the second location, the last official night of the main week, when his voice carries both relief and a thin, practiced smile. He starts with congratulations, as if we have passed some quiet test, acknowledging that most people never reach this point, that surviving 5 nights in these haunted shadows is already unusual. There is a warmth in that greeting, but it is wrapped in warnings, in reminders that the animatronics will be more aggressive, that management is watching, that the building itself seems to lean in when the clock strikes midnight. It is praise delivered with a safety manual stapled to the back. Listen closely and you can hear the way he frames the job as temporary and as something to endure rather than inhabit. He mentions the paycheck, the end of the week, the idea that we will be moving on soon, and beneath those gentle phrases is an admission. This is not meant to be anyone's long-term future. The company cycles through guards the way it cycles through animatronics and locations, and he knows it. When he tells us that a new guard might take over, or that the schedule may change after the weekend, it sounds less like planning and more like a quiet acknowledgement that people do not last here. By night 5, the way he talks about danger has shifted. On earlier nights, he still explained, still justified, still tried to soften the edges of each threat. Now he speaks about life-threatening risks, as if they were items on a closing checklist, something to tick off before the end of the shift. And use the mask. Watch the vents. Don't forget the music box. His tone is calm, almost drowsy, as if we are drifting slowly through a routine that should never have become routine at all. In that normalization, we see his identity hardening. He is the loyal employee who keeps showing up, keeps recording new messages, keeps telling himself and us that everything is fine because it has to be. The missing children, the bite of 87, the restless spirits that may or may not be pressing against the glass of those plastic faces, all of it is folded into company policy. He has learned to live in the tangled web between what he suspects and what he is allowed to say. Pattern interrupt, just for a moment. Imagine the call ends, the tape clicks off, and we follow him instead of the cameras. The building powers down around him in the quiet hours before dawn. He steps through the security office door, walks past the empty party rooms and their quiet tragedies, and pushes out into the night air. For a brief second, there is no animatronic in his peripheral vision, no blinking light, only the cool outside world and the gentle illusion that the danger stays locked inside. He does not know how many more calls he has left to record, how close the legacy of this place is to claiming him, but the timeline is already closing in, step by step, and the next time his voice reaches us, it will be one step nearer to its final tape. Between locations, what happens to Phone Guy in the gaps? Between that last FNAF2 call and the first ring we hear in FNAF1, the timeline does not go quiet, even if the games do. We drift through a space the series never shows us directly, a stretch of years where buildings close, signs change, and yet familiar voices, like Phone Guys, keep carrying forward through the haunted shadows of Fazbear's history. Locations shut down, remodel or move, but companies like this rarely throw everything away. They keep what still works. They repaint walls, swap out logos, move animatronics and filing cabinets and battered office chairs from one cursed address to the next. And in that slow migration, employees who know the routines, who understand the quirks of the systems, tend to be carried along as well. Phone Guy is one of those people, not important enough to be in the newspapers, but too experienced to be left behind. So we can imagine him there, in the in-between. Not on the phone, not yet, but walking through quiet halls in the daytime, clipboard in hand, as movers unbolt stage lights and roll the old animatronics onto trucks. He would help pack equipment, label boxes of spare endoskeleton parts, coil security camera cables, and then, at the new site, help unbox everything again, learning each new layout as it slowly takes shape. The cameras move, the doors change, but he learns the map every time. With each transition, the training has to change too. New cameras mean new blind spots. New policies mean new ways to phrase the same careful lies. Phone guy, already practiced at giving gentle instructions over the line, would almost naturally be pulled into updating the scripts, revising those welcome messages so that the next guard, half awake in the quiet hours, can be walked through a familiar routine. Step by step, but every closure leaves residue. He would remember the nights when parents gathered in the parking lot, the day the health inspector came, the morning a manager whispered about another missing child. Rumors of hauntings would trail him from one site to the next, like restless spirits that never quite let go, and the sense that the company itself is cursed would grow heavier, even if he never says the word out loud. These are quiet tragedies, stacking slowly in the background of his life. Somewhere in these gaps, he is likely asked to record more general training tapes, not just for a single location, but for future use. Broad safety guidelines, corporate talking points, reminders about costumes and back rooms. Those tapes will drift slowly through storage, copied, archived, forgotten, until fragments resurface years later in the FNAF 3 horror attraction, his voice echoing as a relic of an earlier, still-breathing man. By the time we next hear him at the FNAF 1 location, his words will sound almost the same. But if we listen closely, the cheerfulness has thinned. The jokes feel more brittle, more forced, as though he is trying to convince himself that everything is still normal. And as that new pizzeria opens its doors and the phone rings for another guard, the tangled web around him is already tightening, preparing to turn his next set of calls into his last. A new office, an old voice, entering the FNAF 1 era. And as that new pizzeria opens its doors and the phone rings for another guard, the tangled web tightens again. But this time the stage is smaller, closer, more claustrophobic. We leave the wide party rooms and broken faces of the FNAF 2 location and drift, almost unnoticed, into a different space entirely. The timeline moves forward, and we find ourselves in the first game ever released, yet not the first chapter in this haunted history. The office in FNAF 1 is the first room many of us ever knew in this series, and it feels different the moment we step inside. It is narrow, boxed in, a shallow wedge of space pressed between two heavy metal doors, with a fan, a desk, and a pair of flickering hall lights as your only comforts. No mast to hide behind now, no open vents to listen to, just the quiet hum of equipment and the slow, steady tick of power draining away. You are not drifting slowly through a large, chaotic building anymore. You are pinned in place. I'm watching the shadows at the door, frames grow thicker as the hours pass. That change in layout is not just a gameplay decision. It mirrors the way Phone Guy's role has narrowed. In FNAF 2, he was a company voice, a cheerful guide speaking from somewhere out in the building, somewhere above it all. Here, he is introduced explicitly as what he truly is. The previous night guard, the person who was in this exact office before you, now calling during his last week to train you before he leaves the job behind. The walls are closer, the doors are heavier, and his presence feels closer too. When he says, almost casually, that he worked in that office before you, the emotional tone shifts. This is no longer an abstract tutorial drifting in from a distant control room. It is a handover. We are listening to someone who has watched those same hallways, checked those same cameras, heard those same restless footsteps scraping past the door. The quiet tragedies of this place are not theoretical to him anymore. They are memories. His calls in this era become more personal, even when he is trying to sound corporate and calm. He talks about how the animatronics used to wander, how they used to be allowed to walk around during the day, and he speaks with the weary familiarity of someone who has already spent too many nights in the haunted shadows of this building. He mentions safety protocols, power usage, and door management, but tucked between those instructions is the unspoken admission that he has survived here night after night, and that survival has left a mark as we settle into this new office with him. How we are preparing step by step for a different kind of story. The quiet hours of night one will give way to busier, more desperate nights, and his messages will change with them. In the next part of our timeline, we will move through those calls one night at a time, letting the tale wash over you as his composure frays. His warnings grow sharper, and everything builds toward the moment everyone remembers, the nightfall call, when the training tape becomes a final recording, and the man on the other end of the line stops being a voice and becomes a victim. FNAF One Night One. A calm. Welcome to a deadly routine. So we move, drifting slowly from that broad overview of his calls into the very first night we ever hear him. The moment where this familiar voice stops being an abstract tutorial and becomes an actual man, punching in like you are, and trusting a routine that has not yet betrayed him. Night one in the first game is gentle on the surface, a quiet welcome to a job that, in retrospect, reads like the opening chapter of a tragedy. He begins simply, almost casually, a warm greeting, a mention that he used to work in that office before you, a light acknowledgement that it's a bit of a legal thing, that he has to read this out. Short, grounding phrases at first, as if this is just one more scripted message in a long company history. But very quickly, his words lengthen and tangle, and the list of the hazards starts to spill out. A bite here, a missing person there, a reference to the bite of 87 dropped into the conversation the way someone might mention a broken air conditioner. He tells us the animatronics tend to wander during the quiet hours, that they're left in free roaming mode to keep their servos from locking up, and he folds this into the company line with a practiced ease, as though he has repeated it many times. Then comes the strangest part, delivered with that almost joking tone. If they see you after hours, they may not recognize you as a person. They may see you as a naked endoskeleton, and company policy says that any endoskeleton without a suit must be forcibly stuffed into one. It is absurd, and he lets it sound absurd, a half-laughing explanation that brushes against horror while pretending it is only policy. In that moment, we can hear how corporate explanation blends with urban legend, step by step. He sounds like an older employee passing on what he was told. He half believes it because the rules are written down, and he half mocks it because no rational workplace should function like this. The result is a strange comfort, a sense that this is just the strange legacy of a haunted restaurant, a story that lives in the haunted shadows of staff rooms and break tables. He reassures you that the previous guard finished his week and moved on, as if that one sentence can anchor you against everything else he has just implied. survival is possible. The routine works. People clock in, endure the restless spirits of the place without naming them, and clock out again, for now. If we let the tale wash over us, we can hear something else beneath the policy language and the nervous humor. A man who still trusts that routine, who believes the worst is behind the company, not ahead. As you lie there listening, somewhere along this timeline, he is recording that message, unaware that his own calls are already part of a tangled web leading toward a final night. He cannot yet imagine a night we will reach soon, when the calm introduction gives way to the sound of his last breath. F, N, A, F. One night two. When familiar animatronics feel less friendly. And so, after that first, almost comforting introduction, we move with him into night two, where the familiar voices and familiar animatronics begin to feel a little less friendly, and the quiet hours at Freddy Fazbear's take on a different weight. The routine is the same. The phone rings. His tone is still bright and practiced, yet we can hear, drifting slowly beneath the surface, that he knows this is the point in the timeline when things usually start to go wrong. He doesn't talk about policies now, not really. Instead, he talks about them, as if he is running through a mental list of co-workers on a difficult shift. Bonnie, he explains, is often the first to move, a restless presence on the left side, slipping through the shadows in a way that suggests experience rather than guesswork. Chica, he notes, prefers the right, lingering in the kitchen where the cameras fail, as though he has already spent nights learning that empty clatter by heart. The way he describes their behavior patterns feels almost like office gossip, a gentle catalogue of quirks rather than a bestiary of threats, which is its own quiet tragedy. Then, almost as a pattern interrupt, he brings up Foxy, Pirate Cove, the curtain. His voice shifts just slightly as he warns you not to ignore that darkened stage, not to let the curtain stay closed on your monitor for too long. And the advice lands with the weight of personal history. This is not theory. This sounds like a man who once looked away, who let the cameras rest for a moment too long, and found himself suddenly face to face with something lunging down the hallway faster than he believed an animatronic could move. There is an affection in the way he talks about them, but it is an affection with firm edges, as if the company's mascots are old colleagues he has had drinks with after work, yet has also seen in their worst, most haunted shadows. He laughs softly at their quirks, but he always pairs that warmth with clear boundaries. Check the lights, close the doors, watch Foxy, conserve power. Step by step, his survival has been carved into a checklist, and you can almost feel the legacy of a dozen near misses hiding in every calm instruction. Each specific tip is a fossilized moment, a fragment of a night when he nearly did not make it to sunrise, now polished into training material for another innocent guard. Watch Bonnie's blind spots. Listen for Chica in the kitchen. Don't forget Pirate Cove. Through him, the restless spirits become workplace hazards, and the tangled web of possession and murder is translated into a quiet, practical routine you can follow half asleep, if you let the tale wash over you. Yet in that confidence, there is a shadow. He speaks like someone who believes the rules are enough, that if you respect their patterns, you will be safe. We, following this history forward, know there will come a night when the rules bend, when one animatronic moves off script, when his own recording will not end in a gentle sign-off, but in something much shorter and much colder. And as night 2 fades, we are left wondering, on which night did his last trick finally fail? FNAF 1 Night 3, the weight behind the laughter, And as that question hangs in the dark, we move gently forward, drifting slowly into night 3, where the routine is beginning to feel worn at the edges. The call still comes, the tape still rolls, but there is a faint change now, a weight behind the familiar greeting, as if the long, quiet hours have finally begun to press down on him. His tone on night 3 is not dramatically different, yet it is undeniably softer, more tired, the cheerfulness a little thinner around the edges. Where night 1 was brisk and professional, and night 2 carried the careful confidence of someone explaining a game they believed they understood, night 3 sounds like a man who has not slept well in days, or who has listened to the building creak and the animatronics move in the haunted shadows just beyond his line of sight. He speaks as though he is reassuring himself as much as he is reassuring you. We hear it most clearly when he brushes off the rumors. He mentions that people have been talking again, that there are stories about the animatronics, about them moving in ways they should not, about faces seen where no one should be. Then, almost too quickly, he insists that it is nothing, that these are only stories, that everything is fine, even as his words slow and his voice tightens on certain syllables. It is the sound of someone repeating the company line, while the memory of something he has actually seen lingers just behind his teeth. He leans on policy to protect himself. He reminds you of the security doors, of the limited power, and of the cameras you must watch, and he frames it all as reasonable, as if the decisions made by Fazbear Entertainment are grounded in ordinary workplace safety rather than in a long history of quiet tragedies. When he references the legal requirements and the need to keep the animatronics from damaging property or hurting anyone, we can hear the tension between what he is supposed to say and the unspoken legacy of missing children, strange smells, and restless spirits that haunt this place. Again and again, he turns to laughter. Not bright laughter, but a quick, nervous chuckle after he mentions being stuffed into a suit, or after he describes what the endoskeletons might do if they find you out of uniform. It is humor used like a thin blanket, pulled over something much colder, as though if he can frame these possibilities as a joke, he can keep the darkness at arm's length for one more night. We, listening along this timeline, let the tale wash over us and recognize that this is coping, not comfort. Step by step, night 3 brings us closer to the edge. His voice still makes it to the end of the message, still signs off with that practiced, weary optimism. But we know now that we are only one night away from the call that will not finish, from the moment when another presence in the room will interrupt him, and the tape will capture not advice, but the end of his shift forever. Building tension, softly. A pause. Before the death call, step by step, we've watched his voice change. At the toy location, he was the upbeat trainer, the friendly guide in your ear who made murderous mascots sound like a quirky workplace hazard, and a man who could mention facial recognition and criminal databases in the same gentle breath and still sound like this was all just another shift on the timeline of a growing company. Back then, he joked about the bite of 87, brushed past missing children, and trusted the script he'd been given, confident that procedure and policy could hold back whatever haunted shadows were starting to stir. By the time we reach the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, something in that voice has worn thin. The same man is still talking, still reading from a corporate outline, but the edges are frayed now, the pauses a little longer, the reassurances a little less convincing, as if he's trying to convince himself as much as us that everything is fine. We hear him mention the animatronics' quirks, their restless spirits translated into technical jargon, and when we can feel how his confidence has been quietly eroded by night after night in the dark. If we listen across the games as one continuous history, drifting slowly from FNAF 2 to FNAF 1 to the tapes that echo in FNAF 3, we can trace that erosion like a slow leak. From the bright, toy-coloured offices with their cheerful posters, to the cramped, grimy room with a single fan and a creaking door, his tone travels with us, falling from casual to weary, from optimistic to resigned. These are not the words of a man who started out afraid. They are the words of a man who learned, one incident at a time, what the company would hide, what tragedies would never make it into the official reports, and all of it, every word, was likely recorded in real time. He was not making an audiobook for future theorists, not imagining that, years later, our people would freeze the audio, enhance the background sounds, and dissect his every nervous laugh. He was just doing his job, leaving messages for the next innocent guard, believing these calls would live and die within a single week's schedule, not echo through a tangled web of sequels, novels, and late-night videos. For a moment, picture him clearly, alone in a similar office, phone pressed to his ear, the hum of the fan and the distant clank of metal filling the quiet hours around him. He is trying to sound calm for someone else's sake, trying to keep his breathing even, trying to make this feel like a normal training call, while just out of sight, something moves in the shadows of the hallway. Let the tale wash over you here. We slow down on purpose, letting the noise of jump scares and theories fall away, and simply sit with the image of this man, caught between company loyalty and encroaching fear, between the legacy of Fazbear and his own small private dread. This is our pause, our deep breath before the next descent, because next we will walk through his final call, sound by sound. We will listen to what breaks, to what enters the room, to what the tape captures in those last restless seconds, and we will follow his story all the way to the moment the line goes dead. FNAF 1 Night 4, Inside Phone Guy's final call. So we press play. In the quiet hours of Night 4, the tape begins the way it always does, with that familiar, almost comforting greeting, as if nothing in the haunted shadows has truly changed. Yet from the first few words we can hear it. His rhythm is off, his breath is shorter. His sentences clip against each other like doors that will not quite close. He tries to keep the routine going, mentioning how things are getting real, giving you, the next guard, the usual blend of reassurance and warning. But there is a new tremor under the words, a quiet tragedy curling at the edges of his voice. He moves faster through the explanations, skipping the gentle digressions he allowed himself on earlier nights, as though he is reading from a script and watching the hallway at the same time, as though this might be the last time he ever gets to say any of it out loud. Behind him, the building is no longer still. We hear the first heavy bangs, not close enough to be at his door, but not distant enough to be safely ignored, each metallic thud echoing through vents and hollow walls that have heard too many restless spirits. There are faint footsteps, the uneven clank of endoskeleton feet on tile, drifting slowly from one channel of the audio to the other, telling us without words that at least one animatronic is already inside his space, not just on the cameras, but in the same suffocating air. Step by step, the atmosphere of the call tilts. His tone, once professionally calm, starts to fray. He laughs nervously at his own advice, mentions that if he does not make it, you should try to get the replacement suit checked, as if bureaucracy still matters while something hunts him. A rattling, like a closet or supply room being opened, slips into the background, and we can almost picture a door somewhere behind him, swinging slowly on its hinges, letting the shadows in. Then there is the moment where his voice truly breaks. He cuts himself off mid-thought. Our glances, we imagine, at a monitor or a window just out of frame, and the words become shorter, sharper, more urgent. He is not explaining anymore. He is stalling for time. The banging grows louder, closer, joined by that hollow metallic scraping that suggests a body of metal brushing against a doorway, testing the frame, learning the room. For the first time across all his calls, we can hear fear without the mask. In the final seconds, the soundscape takes over. A deep, shuddering groan of machinery, a frantic clatter, the panicked rustle of the receiver as he raises it or drops it, and then that unmistakable animatronic screech, distorted by distance and cheap tape, yet still sharp enough to cut through the dream. Static blooms, swallowing his last unfinished syllable, and the line dies in a wash of noise that feels less like a simple cut, and more like a life being erased from the timeline. We are left with an empty channel and a question that lingers in the quiet. Which animatronic stood in that room with him? And if we listen carefully to every echo and every footstep, what does the audio really tell us about the face he saw in those final, flickering moments? Who killed Phone Guy? Following the audio clues. So we lean in together and listen again to that final message, drifting slowly through the static, trying to separate fear from fact and rumor from the faint mechanical sounds hiding behind his voice. In the quiet hours of night 4, the game gives us a rare gift. Not just words, but the audio texture of a death in progress. A tiny window into the haunted shadows just outside his office door. Fans have named their suspects like a lineup of restless spirits. Freddy, with his slow, deliberate advance and his mocking jingle. Chica, known for lingering in the kitchen, where clattering plates and distant bangs echo through the building. Bonnie, heavy-footed and relentless, sweeping down the left hall. Foxy, explosive and direct, a sprinting blur from Pirate Cove. And for some, the more elusive Golden Freddy, whose presence feels less like footsteps and more like a glitch in reality, a quiet tragedy manifesting in a single, overwhelming moment. On the call, we hear the first clue, the deep, metallic thuds of something moving closer, step by step, followed by the distinctive rattling and pounding on the office door, and that door banging matches Foxy's in-game behavior almost perfectly. The way he slams against the metal when he reaches you, as if testing the barrier between your fragile safety and his cold, animatronic shell. For a moment, it sounds as though Foxy has arrived, eager and violent. But then the pattern interrupts. The banging stops. The room grows quiet. And floating up through that silence comes Freddy's music box jingle. The same gentle, mocking tune you hear when Freddy is already in the room with you, hidden in the darkness, waiting for the lights to go out. In terms of pure game mechanics, Foxy attacks from the hall, while Freddy's kill screen is preceded by that soft, almost playful melody, like a lullaby twisted into something cruel. The timing matters. By night 4, all of them are fully active. Freddy has begun his slow advance through the building. Chica and Bonnie roam freely, and Foxy's curtain is wide open. The sequence we hear on the tape, door assault, then sudden quiet, then Freddy's jingle, then the distorted screech, lines up most cleanly with a scenario where Foxy reaches the door, finds it closed, and then Freddy slips inside later, perhaps when Phone Guy, distracted and exhausted, forgets to check a light or conserve power. Some cling to Chica's kitchen noises, or to the idea of Golden Freddy materializing without warning, because this timeline is a tangled web of overlapping tragedies and secret appearances. Yet when we weigh the clues gently, Freddy emerges as the most likely executioner, the one standing over Phone Guy as the tape cuts out. Still, the ambiguity feels deliberate, as if Scott wanted that final moment to stay half hidden, an echo rather than a confession. What matters in the end is not which mask delivered the final blow, but that this is the instant his role changes in the history of Freddy's. From this night forward, his cheerful guidance is no longer a living voice on the other end of the line, but a recorded echo, a ghost of corporate training, playing back long after he has joined the other victims in the shadows. As we move onward in the timeline, we will see how those echoes resurface and how his legacy lingers in other tapes, other buildings, and perhaps other dreams. Night 5 and 6 without him, the echo of an absent voice. And so, when we reach night 5, we step into an office that feels the same on the surface, yet quietly altered beneath it, as if the air itself remembers that last desperate message. You still sit in the same swivel chair, still watch the same flickering cameras, still listen to the hum of the fan and the restless whir of old machinery. But now, there is a new question hanging over the quiet hours. What happens when the phone rings and there is no one left to guide you? The bell chimes, the line clicks, and for a heartbeat, you almost expect his familiar, slightly awkward greeting, that cheerful reassurance that has walked us step by step through each escalating night. Instead, you are met with static, garbled noise, or a warped fragment of a message that never quite resolves into words, like a memory trying and failing to surface. The sound crawls in around the edges of the office, thin and distant, and the absence of his steady voice becomes louder than any scream. Without him, the room feels wider and emptier, as though a thin layer of protection has been stripped away and the haunted shadows are now pressing closer to the glass. Before, even when the animatronics crept down the halls, there was the sense that someone on the other end of the line understood this place, that we were not entirely alone in its tangled web of policies and quiet tragedies. Now, the ringing phone is a reminder that help is no longer coming, that the last living thread connecting us to the outside world has been quietly severed. In that silence, we begin to understand that his role was never just a tutorial, never just a corporate script. He was a narrative anchor, a human presence in a mechanical nightmare, a proof that another ordinary person had sat in this chair, had worried about power usage, had joked about the bite of 87 while trying not to think too hard about the missing children. His nervous laughter, his offhand references to history the company would rather bury. All of it made this more than a game of lights and doors. It made it a story with a fragile mortal witness. Yet, by night 5 and 6, we realize that we no longer truly need him to survive. We have internalized his advice, memorized his warnings about blind spots and door lights, learned to listen for Foxy's footsteps and Freddy's distant song, until our hands move almost automatically, drifting slowly from camera to door, in a rhythm he helped teach us. In a quiet way, his training lives on through our actions. Every careful glance at the monitor, every disciplined decision to conserve power is part of his lingering legacy. As we continue into the higher nights, into custom challenges and beyond, his silence becomes a kind of echo, a reminder that this timeline is filled with voices that begin bright and end abruptly. But his story does not truly end here. Later, in other buildings and on other tapes, we will hear familiar cadences and recycled phrases, recordings meant for new guards who will never meet the man behind them. His voice, preserved on magnetic tape and corporate archives, will resurface like a restless spirit, woven into training messages, a gentle prelude to deeper tragedies still waiting in the dark. Was Phone Guy complicit? The company man question. His voice survives, but now, in these quiet hours of the timeline, we have to ask what that voice was really doing. Was it guiding frightened new guards through the dark, or gently steering them away from truths they were never meant to see? If we listen closely, drifting slowly through each message, we hear how often Phone Guy downplays the danger, how carefully he wraps sharp edges in soft words. On night 1 of the first game, he calls the animatronics a bit quirky at night, as if roaming metal suits and potential death are just part of the job. He repeats the company's favorite phrases about family fun and safety, reminding you that Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for injury or dismemberment, as though legal disclaimers are a lullaby. Each warning is framed as normal, expected, almost routine, and in that gentle framing we feel the company's hand. Step by step, this creates a pattern. When he mentions the bite of 87, his tone in the prequel location is almost casual, an offhand remark about the frontal lobe, followed by a quick return to policy and schedules. When the missing children incident hangs in the air, he does not name it outright. Instead, he hints at issues and rumors, then pivots back to cameras, doors, and battery life. We are left in the haunted shadows between what is said and what is carefully left unsaid. This leaves us with a quiet question of alignment. Is he in denial, clinging to the script because admitting the truth would shatter whatever dream of normal employment he has left? Is he afraid, knowing that people who speak too plainly in this building do not always walk out again? Or is he, in his own small way, part of the machine, a company man smoothing over quiet tragedies so that the restaurant can keep its doors open one more day? There are moments where he seems to know exactly where the line is. In FNAF 2, he acknowledges that management wants the place open despite recent events, but he never describes the bodies, the crying parents, the restless spirits gathering around the stage. In FNAF 1, on the night of his death call, he does not confess or explain. He simply follows the pattern, gives one last set of instructions, and lets the approaching footsteps speak for him. It feels like a man who understands the tangled web he is caught in, yet refuses to tug too hard at any thread. Fans have split along that fracture. Some see him as an accomplice, a willing participant in the cover-up, who knew about the murders, knew about the suits, and still chose to reassure new hires instead of warning them away. Others read him as another victim of Fazbear's culture of secrecy, a tired employee reciting corporate lines because that is all he has, his humanity slowly worn down by policy memos and incident reports. Perhaps both readings are true, coexisting in the same weary voice. And if that weary body finally dies alone in that office, under flickering lights and failing power, what becomes of a man who spent so long recording his voice for the company's machines? In a place where echoes linger and history refuses to sleep, we have to wonder whether his story ends with that scream, or whether his voice finds new ways to answer the phone. From man to message, Phone Guy's voice after death. So the body is gone, the scream has faded, and the office light has gone dark. But in this timeline, that is not the end of Phone Guy, because even after night 4, even after that weary voice should fall silent, we keep hearing him, drifting slowly through new nights, new buildings, new tapes that play as if nothing terrible ever happened at all. In Five Nights at Freddy's 1, his final call is live, raw, filled with distant banging and that familiar mechanical groan. But every other message we hear is already a recording, a prepared script the company can loop for each innocent new hire. Night 1's cheerful welcome, Night 3's nervous warnings, even the short defeated message on Night 5. All of them are Phone Guy captured on tape, preserved as company property, continuing to work long after his shift has ended. We listen in the quiet hours, knowing he is already dead in the story, yet his voice still patiently explains how to survive. FNAF 2 pushes this feeling further. Chronologically earlier, yet discovered later in our journey, we hear a younger, slightly more optimistic Phone Guy leaving nightly updates, training us on the toy animatronics, mentioning the bite of 87 with that careful corporate distance. These calls are also recorded, queued up by the system, played back on schedule. By the time we first encounter them as players, his body has already fallen in another office, but his voice is still there, calmly walking us step by step through safety protocols and company spin. This creates a quiet tragedy at the heart of his character. In universe, he dies on night 4, yet across games his words keep greeting new guards, as if time inside the phone system has come loose from the rest of the haunted history. We are listening to a dead man who does not know he is dead, a man whose final legacy is to be endlessly helpful, endlessly reassuring, while restless spirits gather just beyond the doors. And that, in a strange way, mirrors the real world. Companies record training messages, safety briefings, onboarding speeches, and those voices can outlive the people who spoke them by decades. A manager retires, a trainer passes away, but their instructions still echo through crackling speakers in empty break rooms. The human being disappears, while the disembodied message keeps doing its job, reduced to a tool, a loop, a policy in audio form. At Freddy's, under haunted shadows and flickering lights, this ordinary corporate habit becomes something else. In FNAF 3, and we do not hear Phone Guy directly, but we do hear training tapes for the old Springlock suits, guiding us through dangerous procedures in that same bland procedural tone. They are relics from an earlier era, replayed in a horror attraction built on tragedy, his words now part of the set dressing. His voice, or one like it, has become a residual haunt, a loop that cannot stop running, even as the building around it rots. Pattern interrupt. Imagine walking through that attraction for the first time, not as the security guard, but as a guest. The air smells of dust and old carpet. Fake cobwebs hang from the ceiling. And somewhere behind the walls, a tape clicks on, calmly explaining how not to die in a Springlock suit, as if anyone still working there is alive enough to care. In that moment, we gently leave the cramped FNAF 1 office and step into the dim corridors of Fazbear's Fright, where history has been turned into a theme, and where Phone Guy's lingering guidance becomes part of the show. The office chair is gone, replaced by a creaking swivel seat in a security booth surrounded by monitors and static. The old restaurant has burned, closed, and been forgotten by most, but the recordings remain, carrying his presence forward along the tangled web of this story. So as we move on in the timeline, let the tale wash over you. The man has died, but the message endures, playing quietly in the background of every new nightmare Fazbear builds. Enter FNAF3, a museum of old nightmares. Those recordings do not stay buried for long. As we drift forward in the timeline, we find them resurfacing in a place that should not exist, a place that treats everything we have just walked through as decor, as if the quiet tragedies of this history were nothing more than props on a shelf. Welcome to Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction. It is not a restaurant, not a birthday destination, but a low-budget museum of old nightmares, built in the shadows of a forgotten franchise. The new owners scour abandoned buildings and auction lots, pulling together tattered posters, cracked masks, broken animatronic shells, and any rumor they can find about what really happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, until the whole place feels like a haunted scrapbook of the company's legacy. Step by step, they assemble something that is half funhouse and half crime scene reenactment. There are no cheerful stage lights here, and only dim green bulbs and flickering hallways where visitors are meant to laugh nervously at fake blood, dusty party rooms, and staged security offices. The tragedies are distant to them, like an urban legend told at a sleepover, and the line between performance and reality blurs quietly in the dark. In putting this attraction together, the staff dig through boxes of tapes, binders, and discarded training material, looking for anything that sounds authentic. They are not historians. They are scavengers. Somewhere in that pile of plastic and magnetic ribbon, they find him. Old cassettes labeled for security training, company property, to be played at the start of each shift. They press play, and the familiar chipper voice of phone guy crackles back to life, drifting slowly through the speakers as if he had never stopped talking. Once, and those calls were meant to keep guards alive, to explain camera systems and power usage, to downplay rumors while still acknowledging that something was wrong in the haunted shadows of the pizzerias. Now, the very same words are repurposed as atmosphere, looping in the background for a different kind of night watch employee, one who sits in a replica office inside a horror attraction, where the real suffering has been turned into entertainment. There is a deep, quiet irony in this. The voice that tried to reassure frightened workers, that joked gently about restless animatronics and policy changes, is now a sound effect, a layer of static and nostalgia designed to unsettle paying guests. We hear him describe suits, accidents, and procedures, but here, those warnings are no longer a lifeline. They are a script, and if we listen closely, in these Fazbear's Fright tapes, we begin to notice something else. Some of his messages seem older, reaching back to a time before the first game, when Springlock suits were still in regular use, when employees were trained in how to wear them safely, when the company's tangled web of secrets was only beginning to form. His casual references to Springlock failures and backrooms hint that he knew more than he ever admitted, and as his voice echoes through this low-lit museum, it quietly opens the door to the Springlock era waiting just ahead in the timeline. The FNAF3 training tapes, phone guy as corporate ghost, and then, as we move from that dim museum floor into the next corridor of this history, his voice changes. The casual night shift chatter of the earlier calls gives way to something more polished, more deliberate, like we've stepped from a messy back office into a quiet corporate training room where every word has been weighed and filed. In the FNAF 3 training tapes, the structure is almost ritualistic. Each message opens with a formal greeting, a careful welcome to Fazbear's Fright, or to The Attraction, followed by references to company policy, manuals, and guidelines that must have existed in some binder long before these haunted shadows were turned into a horror exhibit. He moves step by step through the material, how to approach an animatronic, how to operate the equipment, how to respond to malfunctions, as if reading from a script that has been revised by lawyers and managers who never had to walk the floor at 3 a.m. We can hear it in his tone. Gone is the slightly rambling, off-the-cuff quality of his security office calls. Here, he sounds composed, almost corporate, with a professional calm that feels designed for wide distribution. These aren't late-night reassurance messages to one frightened guard. They're standardized training for anyone who might pass through the company's doors, preserved like a quiet echo of Fazbear's official face. It suggests oversight. Someone was listening, editing, approving, making sure no quiet tragedies slipped through the cracks of what could be said out loud. Within that framework, the content becomes even more revealing. When he explains the Springlock suits, he doesn't hesitate, doesn't stumble over technical language or safety warnings. He walks the listener slowly and methodically through how to enter the suit, how to secure the locks, how to avoid moisture and sudden movement that could trigger a failure. There is a gentle, almost weary familiarity in the way he mentions accidental death or dismemberment, like a man who has repeated this warning many times and perhaps seen what happens when it is ignored. He speaks just as plainly about the safe room protocols, about sealed-off back areas that no customer should ever see, about spaces removed from the official blueprints but still very real in the company's timeline. The way he describes these hidden rooms in that calm, practiced cadence makes it feel as though he has walked them for years, carrying keys and secrets in equal measure. We are drifting slowly through procedures, but underneath them, restless spirits and old decisions are still moving. All of this pulls us back to that earlier Springlock era we touched on before, and when hybrid suits were standard, and the company's tangled web of policies was still being spun. If these tapes really do date back to that time, then Phone Guy isn't just a late-stage employee reacting to a legacy of tragedy. He is one of the voices that formalized how Fazbear handled danger, how it hid it, and how it trained others to live alongside it in the quiet hours. And if these recordings are older than the FNAF 1 calls we know so well, then his story stretches further back than we first imagined, raising a quiet question that lingers as we continue. Just how long has he been there standing in the shadows of every policy, every suit, every locked door, waiting for us to notice? Phone Guy and the Springlock suits. A calm voice over a death trap. And when we finally do notice him, he's standing there in the margins of every rule and every reminder, we also notice what he talks about most comfortably. Not ghosts, not rumors, but hardware. Listen to the Springlock training tapes again, and you can almost feel the chill of that contrast. In the same steady, almost soothing cadence he uses to welcome you to a new shift. He explains how moisture can seep into the mechanisms, how sweat, condensation, or a spilled drink can cause the springs to slip, how a single droplet in the wrong place can turn a costume into a coffin. His voice doesn't rise, it doesn't tremble, it just moves, step by step, through the danger. He tells you not to rush, not to make sudden movements, to sit as still as you can while the locks are engaged, as though he were describing how to clock in rather than how not to die. We hear him outline the process of using a crank to compress the springs, stowing the endoskeleton away, checking the locks, and then, almost gently, reminding you that failure means the suit will most likely snap back with force. Most likely. Such quiet words for such a brutal outcome. That level of detail does not feel theoretical. It feels lived in. We are listening to someone who knows how the metal sounds when it slips, who knows how a jaw plate can slam shut without warning, who may have stood in those quiet hours after an accident, staring at a suit that had to be peeled open piece by piece. Whether he was a technician, a trainer, or a veteran employee who watched others make fatal mistakes, the knowledge sits in his voice like a heavy weight, wrapped in calm. And yet, he never names anyone. There are no specific victims, and no dates, no vivid retellings of the quiet tragedies that must have unfolded inside those shells. He talks about an incident, about multiple and simultaneous Springlock failures, about the need to move the suits to safe rooms, as if the people crushed inside them were just another maintenance note in a long company history. The haunted shadows are there, but he never points to them directly. This is where he feels most like a company man. He translates horror into bullet points and safety tips, into dry cautions about moisture and movement, letting the tale wash over you as policy instead of confession. While restless spirits linger in the walls, he speaks of proper handling and storage, of keeping the timeline clean, of avoiding lawsuits and bad press. We are left drifting slowly between the lines, hearing a calm instructional voice describe devices that have caused some of the series' most horrific deaths, and wondering what he has seen and what he has agreed never to say out loud. Because after you understand how intimate his knowledge of the suits really is, the next question rises quietly on its own. What else does he know, and what did he help the company bury, just out of sight? Safe rooms, hidden doors, and what phone guy doesn't say? And that quiet question leads us, almost automatically, to the walls themselves. Because in the FNAF 3 training tapes, we hear Phone Guy move from talking about suits and shifts to something more architectural, more secretive, yet delivered in the same calm procedural tone. He starts describing safe rooms, hidden areas built into certain Freddy's locations, are sealed behind false walls and disguised doors, not on the main security map, and not meant for guests or really anyone outside of management and maintenance. They are technically multi-purpose, storage in slow seasons, a fallback in emergencies, a place to retreat if something goes wrong in the dining area. He explains, slowly and methodically, that these rooms will not appear on digital layouts, that cameras will not cover them, that staff should not reference them in any public material. No brochures, no birthday tour scripts, no friendly mentions to curious parents. On paper, they are part of the building's skeleton, yet in practice, they live in the haunted shadows just off the official floor plan, a quiet absence where there should be space. We hear him emphasize discretion, not with fear, but with that gentle corporate firmness, as if this is simply another policy to memorize and then forget. Step by step, the instructions are almost comforting. If there is a fire, if there is a malfunction, if there is a disturbance, you may use the safe room. Keep the door concealed, keep the mechanism locked, keep guests unaware. It's all so neutral, so bloodless, that if you are drifting slowly through these tapes for the first time, half asleep, you might not even register how unsettling that is. A hidden room, unmonitored, unlogged, where anything could happen and the cameras would never tell. But we, following the timeline, know the larger history. We know William Afton favoured those sealed-off spaces, that he used at least one of these safe rooms to store the Spring Bonnie suit, to change into it, and to lure innocent children away from the bright party rooms and into the quiet tragedies that defined Fazbear's legacy. The company calls them safe rooms, for often they become hunting grounds. And Phone Guy, reading corporate copy, sits right at the edge of that tangled web. He never says murder. He never says missing children. Instead, he warns that certain older suits are not to be used, that some spaces are being phased out, that staff should not attempt to go into specific sealed rooms. His voice remains level, but the subtext is heavy. These are places the company wants forgotten, places whose history is being bricked over, both literally and in policy. Here, let the tale wash over you for a moment, and imagine a pattern interrupt. Picture him not in a busy office, but standing alone in one of those rooms as he records, and the restaurant outside is closed. The lights are dim, the air is still. Around him, metal shelving, retired mascots slumped in the corners. Maybe the faint smell of dust and old pizza dough. He holds a cheap microphone reading from a script, his words echoing slightly off unfinished concrete. In that small, hidden space, the restless spirits that will one day define this franchise are still quiet, but the stage is already built for them. In that image, his neutral tone becomes something else, a thin layer of normalcy stretched over a room that has already seen, or soon will see, things no training tape could ever safely describe. And as we move forward in the timeline, those sealed doors and forgotten corners will keep returning, each one a quiet reminder that at Freddy's, the worst things almost always happen just out of sight. Did Phone Guy survive longer than we think? And in those out-of-the-way corners, another question waits for us, drifting slowly back to the surface. How long did Phone Guy's voice really echo through this company's history? On the surface, the answer seems simple. The instructional tapes we hear in Fazbear's Fright during Five Nights at Freddy's 3 are usually read as older material, relics from the days when Springlock suits were still proudly advertised instead of quietly buried. The calm walkthrough of wearing the suit, the warnings about moisture and sudden movement, all of it feels like an early chapter in the timeline, back when corporate still believed they could manage these quiet tragedies with a checklist and a smile. Most of us place them before the first game, before that desperate Nightfall call. But there is a softer, stranger theory that slips through the cracks, one that asks whether some of those recordings might have been made later, or even repurposed after his death. We know Fazbear Entertainment has a habit of recycling. Locations, costumes, endoskeletons, even birthday posters that linger long after the parties have stopped. It would not be out of character for them to lift an older training tape, stitch in a new introduction, and send it back out as updated guidance for a different guard, at a different time, under different haunted shadows. If we follow that thread, we can imagine Phone Guy recording multiple sets of messages over his career, each one tailored to a slightly different crisis. Early tapes for Springlock performers, later calls for night guards in the classic pizzerias, emergency notes when the bite of 87 forces policy changes. What we hear across FNAF 1, FNAF 2, and FNAF 3 may not be a straight line through history, but a tangled web of reused audio and out-of-order warnings, shuffled by a company that cares more about liability than linearity. Fans have listened closely for any lines in the FNAF 3 tapes that might hint at knowledge of events after the first game. Does he reference missing children in the way he does later? Does his tone carry that edge of barely contained fear we hear on night 4? For the most part, the evidence still pulls us back to the earlier interpretation. These Springlock instructions sound like they belong to a more innocent phase, when the suits were tools, not tombs, and the restless spirits had not yet fully claimed the stage. Yet, in a sleep story sense, his voice becomes almost unmoored from time. As Fazbear reuses his words, shuffling cassettes from drawer to drawer, we hear him as if through the walls of the timeline itself, drifting slowly between eras, repeating the same gentle cautions to guards who will never meet each other but share the same fate. In the quiet hours, his calls feel less like dated memos and more like echoes, a legacy preserved on a cheap magnetic tape. And beyond those official recordings, there are whispers that Phone Guy's presence lingers in other, less obvious corners of the series, waiting for us to find him again as we move deeper into the dreamlike history of Fazbear Entertainment. Spirit, residual, or just a tape? Haunting theories of Phone Guy. So, as we sit with those echoes in the dark, we reach a quiet crossroads in his story, and where technology and the supernatural blur together in the same haunted shadows. Phone Guy's voice keeps returning to us, drifting slowly through each new playthrough, and we're left to ask what exactly we're really hearing when that phone begins to ring. The most grounded reading is also the simplest, and it fits neatly into Fazbear's corporate mindset. In this view, there is no ghost at all. There is only a man who once lived, recorded his training messages, and died off screen, while the company quietly filed his tapes away and reused them for every new night guard. His night 1 cheerfulness, his night 4 panic, even that final cut-off scream in the first game, become nothing more than archival audio, a cost-saving measure in a place that cuts corners on everything from door power to employee safety. We are not speaking with him, and we are listening to a product. But there is another theory, and it lives a little closer to the restless spirits that define this timeline. In that softer, more uncanny interpretation, Phone Guy becomes a residual haunting, not a conscious ghost, but a memory loop imprinted on the walls, the phone lines, the cheap speakers of the office. His training calls play out like a recording in more ways than one, repeating the same phrases, the same jokes, the same warnings, as if the building itself remembers him and presses play each night. Just as the animatronics repeat their roots, and the children's agony repeats its quiet tragedies, his words circle back again and again, a habit the pizzeria cannot quite let go of. Then we have the stronger, more chilling proposal, the one that leans into the deeper horror. In that telling, our Phone Guy's spirit is not merely an echo, but an active presence, bound to the security systems he once maintained, lingering in the switchboards, the cameras, the tangled web of wires that knit the restaurant together. He knows what hunts you because he has been through it. He warns you about conserving power, about checking Pirate Cove and the vents, not as a pre-recorded script, but as a weary guardian, still doing his job after death, still trying, in his own limited way, to keep the next guard alive. When we compare this to the children, though, the contrast is gentle but clear. Their hauntings are vivid and personal, animatronics turning their heads, eyes following you in the quiet hours, their tragedy pulsing at the center of the series' history. Phone Guy, by comparison, is mundane, procedural, a man of policy and memos, and that makes a fully realized ghost story for him feel less certain, as if the universe of FNAF reserves its most direct manifestations for the innocent. So we leave him there, suspended between tape and spirit, between man and echo, and let the tale wash over you without forcing an answer. When that phone rings again, as we move step by step into later facilities and digital realms, you can decide for yourself whether you're hearing a living memory, a lingering soul, or just a company message that refused to fade. Comparing tones, early cheer verses, final resignation. And as that ring echoes in your memory, we can listen to how his voice itself drifts along the timeline, changing with the company's fortunes and with his own quiet tragedies. We do not see his face. We only hear the way his tone rises and falls, the way his confidence erodes, the way the haunted shadows slip into his words. In the FNAF 2 nights, set earlier in the history, he almost sounds bright. On night 1, he greets you with a casual, upbeat cadence, joking about the old location, brushing off rumors, talking about some kind of learning initiative with the toy animatronics, as if he truly believes Fazbear Entertainment is still building a future. His warnings come wrapped in a friendly rhythm, and even when he mentions the bite of 87, it's like a strange piece of trivia in a corporate training video, rather than a tragedy he carries home. We can feel a man who still trusts the script, who still thinks the worst stories belong to the past. By the time we reach FNAF 1, later in the timeline, that brightness has dimmed. The calls are shorter, the jokes thinner, and the pauses longer. On night 1, he tries to sound the same, but there is a weary strain under the surface, a quiet rasp when he mentions the animatronics getting a bit quirky at night, as if he has repeated this line too many times to believe it. Night by night, his tone tightens. The cheer gives way to something more brittle, and when we finally hear his death call on night 4, the facade collapses into raw panic, metal footsteps, and a cut-off scream. The stakes are no longer hypothetical. They are in the room with him. Then, drifting slowly even further along the timeline, we arrive at the FNAF 3 training tapes. Here, his voice is familiar but distant, wrapped in formality. He addresses employees and management with careful phrasing, reading from a stricter corporate script about Springlock suits and safety protocols, and the warmth is mostly gone, replaced by a measured cadence, like a man who has learned that saying too much is dangerous. It feels as though legal departments and damage control teams are standing just out of frame, guiding every sentence. Taken together, these 3 tones trace a single quiet arc: early optimism, strained survival, and finally, controlled detachment. We hear a man worn down across years of night shifts and cover-ups, a man whose legacy is preserved only as scattered audio in dusty offices and decaying attractions. Yet beyond that voice, there must have been a person who drove home after these shifts, who ate dinner, who dreamed. In the quiet hours outside the pizzeria walls, did he have a family, a favorite song on the radio, a life that the tangled web of Fazbear tragedies slowly devoured? As we step by step move closer to his final nights and possible afterlife, we will have to ask not just how he died, but who he really was before the job claimed him. Phone guy. Off the clock, imagining the man behind the receiver. So, if we accept that there was a person before the job claimed him, we also have to accept that canon leaves us in the quiet dark about who that person was. And in that darkness, we're gently invited to imagine. We know the voice, we know the scripts, but the life wrapped around those calls is left in haunted shadows, and that absence gives us room to picture small, grounded details without breaking the fragile timeline we've been following. We can see him, for a moment, not in the cramped office, but behind a steering wheel. The sky is paling at the edges, and that thin blue that only exists right before dawn, and he's driving home while the rest of the city is just waking up. Street lights are flickering off, bakery signs are humming on, and his eyes are heavy in that way that comes from too many quiet hours watching cameras and doors. He blinks slowly at empty intersections, the pizzeria already shrinking in the rearview mirror, pretending, just for this short drive, that everything he watched through those grainy feeds was normal. At a red light, maybe he reaches out and turns the radio down, not off, letting some faint anonymous song drift in the background, a buffer between him and the memories of restless spirits and metallic footsteps. The world around him is innocent at this hour. Joggers on sidewalks, school buses beginning their routes, a mother loading groceries into a trunk. They have no idea that, a few miles away, a bear and a rabbit stand motionless on a stage that has seen too much. When he finally reaches home, it is not a dramatic lair or a secret lab. We can imagine a small kitchen, a table with a worn edge where his arm always rests, a stack of company memos and training sheets spread out like a paper timeline of corporate denial. He sits, still in his uniform shirt, and reads through lines he will later recite to you, circling phrases with a cheap pen, underlining the parts about nothing to worry about and totally safe, even as he knows the history that those words quietly erase. Beside him, a mug of coffee has gone cold, forgotten as he drifts slowly between focus and exhaustion. He rehearses small jokes aloud, then lets them die into silence, adjusting his tone so it sounds casual, and so you will not hear the strain when he warns you about doors, power, or the bite that everyone pretends to misunderstand. In these moments, he is half employee, half witness, trying to make a script written by lawyers feel like advice from a co-worker. Long-term night work leaves marks that do not always show, and long-term exposure to tragedy leaves marks that never quite fade. Over time, a person in his position can become numb to the horror, yet oddly protective of anyone new, stepping into the same haunted role. That's why his calls in the second game feel brisk and procedural, while his FNAF1 messages carry a softer edge, as if the weight of missing children, of the bite of 87, of quiet tragedies stacked one on another, has taught him to sound more like a guardian and less like a trainer. And it is possible that this is his quiet legacy. Not just what he knew, but how he tried, in small ways, to shield the people who came after him. And that brings us gently back to you. Every time you start a new game, every time you clock in for night one and hear that familiar greeting, he becomes your co-worker again, watching over you from a distance through recorded words. Step by step, as you play, you walk the same halls he once walked, and as we let the tale wash over us, we have to wonder how many times he practiced those lines alone at that kitchen table, trying to keep you alive a little longer than he managed to keep himself. Because soon, in this tangled web of messages and screams, we will arrive at the night when the calls stop and the training tapes become, perhaps, the only echo of the man behind the receiver. A line by line, hidden meanings in his most famous quotes. So now, as we drift from the image of him rehearsing alone at that kitchen table into the recordings themselves, we can begin to move line by line, letting his most familiar phrases unfold into a quiet history of the company's worst nights. We have heard these calls 100 times as background noise, but if we listen closely, they stop being tutorials and start becoming confessions. One of the clearest examples comes from his FNAF, 2 Introduction to the Facial Recognition System. He says, almost breezily, that the new animatronics are tied into criminal databases, that they can detect predators and dangerous individuals, and that this is all in the name of safety. On the surface, it is practical instruction for us as guards, our gentle reassurance that the company is learning from past mistakes. Beneath that calm tone, though, lies an admission. There were already criminals to detect, already missing children, already restless spirits in the haunted shadows of those halls. The technology is not a hopeful beginning. It is a quiet reaction to tragedies we are not allowed to name. Then there is his casual mention of the bite of 87. He drops it almost offhand, noting that it is amazing the victim could live without the frontal lobe before moving briskly back to our duties. Again, the line serves 2 masters. For the player, it anchors the timeline, placing us after a major incident, warning us that the animatronics can and will harm the innocent. For the law, it is a veiled chronicle of corporate denial, and a way of turning a brutal attack into a piece of workplace trivia. His word choice softens the blow, wrapping a life-altering tragedy in the language of, "Oh, by the way," as if the screams have already been filed away in some back office. Step by step, when we arrange these quotes chronologically, a rough history emerges. The facial recognition line hints at post-missing children panic. The bite of 87 remark marks another scar on the timeline, and his later FNAF 1 calls, with their talk of a special place in the back, and don't worry about the empty suits, quietly gesture backwards to the days when bodies were hidden and suits were sealed. What sound like scattered safety notes are, in truth, mile markers through a landscape of cover-ups. And then, at the end of that path, we reach "See you on the flip side." On your first listen, it is a light, almost joking farewell, a way to ease you into another long night. Heard again, after we know his fate, it becomes something else. A man who has seen too much, hinting that there is another side to cross over to, whether that means another shift, another tape, or another state of existence entirely. It is both a promise of continued guidance and a whispered acknowledgement that he may soon join the ghost he never names. Pattern interrupt for a moment. Let your mind drift slowly back through your favorite phone guy line, the one you can still hear in the quiet hours of your own room. Now that we have walked through his euphemisms, his jokes, his carefully chosen silences, listen to that line again in your memory and feel how it has changed, how it carries the weight of a man trying to keep the dream alive while the legacy of tragedy closes in around him. Phone guy and you, why his voice is so comforting in a horror game. And as that line echoes in your memory, we notice something gentle beneath the horror. Something that has been with us from the very first ring of the very first night. Before the doors, before the cameras, before we learn the patterns of these wandering suits, we hear a human voice, stumbling through a script, making this haunted workplace feel, if not safe, at least understandable. Having someone explain the rules, step by step, pulls the game out of pure nightmare and back into a world with structure, with policies, with employee handbooks and corporate excuses. When Phone Guy talks about power usage, about blind spots, are about nothing to worry about, he is quietly telling us that this nightmare has a manual, and that somewhere in the shadows there are adults, managers, a history that can be named. The animatronics may be driven by restless spirits, but the job itself has guidelines, and that makes the fear feel just a little more manageable. Psychologically, he becomes what we might call a safe narrator, someone who has clearly lived with these dangers and, at least for a time, survived them. He speaks from experience, mentioning previous guards, old locations, past incidents that we only glimpse as quiet tragedies in the background. Because he is calm, because he jokes, because he complains about corporate rather than screaming about ghosts, we lean toward believing that if he made it through, maybe we can as well, and his presence wraps the horror in a thin layer of routine, the way a night security guard might sip coffee in a building that everyone else swears is haunted. Across the timeline, that consistency deepens. We hear variations of him in FNAF 1, FNAF 2, and training tapes that reach forward into FNAF 3. And even as locations change and the story's tangled web of dates and murders grows more complex, his voice drifts slowly through it all. He becomes an anchor in the confusion, a familiar tone guiding us through different buildings, different years, different versions of the same nightmare. The walls change, the animatronics change, the company logo changes, but the slightly awkward greeting on night one is still there, like a lighthouse in haunted shadows. Part of what makes him feel like an ally is the contrast. The animatronics are cold, mechanical, inhuman. Their language is static, glitches, the scrape of metal and the echo of distant music boxes. Phone Guy, by comparison, is warm and imperfect. He rambles, he corrects himself, he laughs at his own bad jokes. That slightly dorky professionalism makes him feel less like a faceless corporation and more like a tired co-worker on the other end of the line, doing his best to help you through a shift he knows is worse than the handbook admits. And this is why, in the quiet hours of a sleep story, he fits so naturally. His voice in the original games was already half lullaby, half warning, a gentle murmur about doors and power and legacy and tragedy, laid over the distant hum of fans and buzzing lights. When we take that same tone and let the tale wash over you as you drift toward dream, we are only extending what was always there, a human presence in the middle of the horror, soothing and doomed, speaking softly while the monsters move just out of sight. Alternate theories. Is Phone Guy someone else we know? And once we recognize that human presence, that gentle, doomed voice threading through the buzzing lights, we run into a question that has lingered in the haunted shadows of the fandom for years. Is Phone Guy really just Phone Guy? Or is he someone we already know by another name? As we drifting slowly through this tangled web of theories, one of the calmest and most persistent ideas is that Phone Guy and Fritz Smith are the same person. Fritz is the name printed on the paycheck you see at the end of Five Nights at Freddy's 2. A guard who is hired, warned, and then abruptly fired for tampering with the animatronics and odor. We hear a phone mentor guiding us, and then we see a named employee stepping into that same role. And for many listeners, the pieces feel like they slide neatly into place. Supporters of this connection point to the shared job, the overlapping responsibilities, and the way the timeline folds back on itself. AF2's nights, set earlier in the history, show a guard being cycled through the system, while Phone Guy calmly explains corporate policies, the bite of 87, and the constant pressure to keep the doors open. By the time of FNAF 1, another guard is in the chair, another paycheck will be printed, and the man on the line sounds like someone who has already lived through these quiet tragedies once before, and is now passing on routines that he learned the hard way. But when we move slowly, step by step, the evidence is softer than it first appears. Names on paychecks can be jokes, placeholders or references to playtesters. The series often reuses names like Jeremy and Fritz in ways that blur the line between canon identity and playful nod. Phone Guy never calls himself Fritz, never mentions being fired, never clearly links his own history to the specific guards whose names we see. The overlap in roles may be meaningful, or it may simply reflect how Fazbear chews through the same kind of employee night after night. From there, the theories grow more elaborate. Some imagine that Phone Guy is related to major figures in the lore, a distant Afton cousin, a hidden Emily, a quiet relative watching from the periphery. Others suggest he might be one of the unnamed technicians we glimpse later, a voice that survives as training tapes in FNAF 3, his guidance echoing long after his body is gone. These ideas can be fun to visit in the quiet hours, but when we look for firm proof, they dissolve like a dream on waking. What remains solid is not his surname but his function. He is the voice on the phone, the company's mouthpiece and its conscience, the one who turns horror into procedure and restless spirits into a checklist. His legacy in the timeline is less about who he is on paper and more about how he sounds. Upbeat, nervous, loyal, and increasingly aware that something is deeply wrong. So if we gently set aside every surname and paycheck, every speculative family tree and secret connection, and listen only to what he actually says and what we actually hear, a different picture begins to form in the dim light. In that stripped-down story, without theories to shield him, where does his path truly begin, and where does it finally end? Reconstructing his life, a complete Phone Guy timeline. So to answer that, we have to do something gentle and deliberate. We have to lay his life out on the table, piece by piece, and let the scattered phone calls settle into a single, quiet timeline. Not a theory board with red string, but a slow walk through one man's long night. It begins before we ever hear him, in the age of Springlock suits and corporate optimism. In those early days, when Fredbears and the first Freddys are still new, he is not yet the tired voice on the line, but a dutiful employee in a pressed shirt, standing in a training room with a script in his hands. He helps record those formal tapes about Springlock safety and proper suit usage, repeating phrases about fast, bare entertainment. While, behind the glass, technicians demonstrate how a single slip can turn costume into coffin. In those quiet hours, he learns the company's deepest secrets, the accidents, the locked files, the way management smooths every tragedy into a policy update. From there, we drift forward to the bright plastic glow of the toy location, the era we know as Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Now he is Phone Guy as we first meet him, upbeat and almost cheerful, introducing us to Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, and Mangle as if they were harmless mascots. He mentions facial recognition, criminal databases, even the bite of 87, but frames it all as manageable, as something we can handle if we just follow procedure. And you can hear that he still believes in the brand, or at least wants to. Even as missing children reports hang like haunted shadows over the building, he reassures us that management has everything under control, that the night shift is perfectly safe, that we should simply keep the music box wound and carry on. Years pass in the story world, though only seconds for us, and we arrive at the cramped office of Five Nights at Freddy's 1. The voice is the same, but worn thinner now, drifting slowly between forced friendliness and quiet dread. He's the previous guard this time, the one who has already survived a week of restless spirits staring through the camera feeds. He jokes less, hesitates more, leaves longer, uneasy pauses between corporate talking points. Still, he shows up for us. He walks us, step by step, through power management, armor blind spots, and the strange behavior of the animatronics, loyal enough, or trapped enough, to keep training replacements even as the building's history closes in around him. On his nightfall call, that history finally catches him. The recording stutters, the banging grows louder, the metallic groan of an animatronic entering the office swallows his words, and we listen to his last panicked sounds before the line goes dead. Whether you imagine Freddy's jingle in the dark or another suit looming over him, this is the physical end of his story. One more body in a tangled web of victims and accomplices. And yet, the voice does not quite fade. Years later, in the charred attraction of Fazbear's Fright, fragments of his old training tapes resurface as collectibles, echoing through dusty hallways. In Five Nights at Freddy's 3, he exists only as archival audio, a ghost of corporate procedure playing over speakers while new fires are lit and old sins are exhumed. His life becomes a loop of instructions, a legacy of warnings that arrived too late. When we step back, the effect is strangely simple. From Springlock trainee to toy-era optimist, to weary FNAF 1 guard, to a disembodied voice in FNAF 3, his path feels like one long shift stretched across decades. A single, unbroken night spent watching cameras, obeying company lines, and slowly realizing that the real monsters were never just the animatronics. As we move onward in the timeline, we'll see how other workers, other tapes, and other voices are pulled into that same pattern, and how few of them ever truly clock out. But what Phone Guy knew, and what he never lived to see. So when we think of Phone Guy's long, unbroken night, we can pause here and ask what he actually saw, and what lay far beyond the edge of his own horizon. His story is folded into the earlier chapters of this timeline, pressed between security logs and cheerful recordings, while we, drifting slowly through the decades, can see how much more the haunted history of Freddy's would become. He almost certainly knew about the missing children incident, even if he never spoke its name. By the time you hear him in FNAF 1, he casually mentions a week of police investigations and a previous location where animatronics were left to rot in the back. He would have known about the party rooms closed off overnight, the posters taken down, and the way parents stopped bringing their innocent children because of whispered rumors in the quiet hours. He knew about the bite of 87 too, alluding to it in FNAF 2 with that uneasy, offhand tone, like someone repeating a story they wish they could forget. He knew Springlock accidents were real, not just training tape warnings. He references the old suits being very uncomfortable and not worth the risk, and that only comes from seeing, or at least hearing, what happens when those logs fail and metal slams shut on a living body. He watched locations open with bright promises and close under haunted shadows. The older Freddy's that shut down after the disappearances. The toy-era restaurant of FNAF 2 closing its doors. The FNAF 1 building already described as a kind of last-ditch effort. Step by step, he saw Fazbear's legacy shrinking, each reopening a little more desperate than the last. But there are things he never lived to see. He never walked the charred halls of Fazbear's Fright in FNAF 3, where his own recycled training tapes play over speakers as a cruel echo, guiding a new guard through a horror attraction built on his tragedy. He never saw the final pizzeria burn, the ultimate fire meant to free restless spirits and end William Afton's grip. Those late flames, those collapsing ceilings, belonged to a future beyond his final scream. His understanding of the hauntings was probably incomplete. He knew the animatronics behave strangely at night, that they get a bit quirky, that they seem to recognize guards as endoskeletons out of costume. Yet he still framed it as malfunction and policy, and not a tangled web of possessed metal and remnant. He felt the wrongness, but he did not know the full shape of the ghosts. There is a bittersweet thought that in death, when his own shift finally ended, he may have joined that invisible crowd and at last understood what was really moving the animatronics. Perhaps in those drifting, dreamlike moments after the office door failed, the company man finally saw the children, the puppet, the man in the yellow suit, and this quiet gap between what he knew and what we know now is part of why his story feels like one of the quiet tragedies of this series. A small life caught in a storm he never fully saw, while the timeline moves onward without him. I'm Phone Guy as tragic everyman of the FNAF universe. And this quiet gap between what he knew and what we know now is part of why his story feels like one of the quiet tragedies of this series. A small life caught in a storm he never fully saw, while the timeline moves onward without him. When we pull back, drifting slowly above the cameras and hallways, Phone Guy stops feeling like a single person and starts to look like a stand-in for everyone who ever punched in at a Fazbear time clock and hoped the night would be uneventful. He is the voice we hear, but behind that voice there are janitors who stayed late to mop up after birthday parties, mechanics who crawled into the cramped spaces behind stage curtains to fix a stuck jaw, and guards who sat through the quiet hours watching static screens. He becomes the one name, the one tone, arm that carries the weight of countless unnamed workers who cleaned, repaired, and guarded these haunted shadows over the years, all of them brushing against restless spirits without ever seeing the full shape of the curse. Unlike the great villains and architects of this tangled web, he has no grand design, no experiment with remnant, no master plan to cheat death or control it. He is not Afton, hiding knives behind a smile, and he is not Henry, building elaborate traps to end an era. He is simply trying to do his job, reading the corporate script, improvising where he has to, and trying, in his own limited way, to help you survive your shift so you can collect a modest paycheck and go home. Listen to his calls and you can hear that quiet loyalty and the way he keeps defending the company even as he admits the animatronics can be unpredictable, even as he references the bite of 87 with that almost casual tone. It echoes real stories in our own world, where people stay in unsafe jobs, where they normalize alarms and broken locks and strange policies, because rent is due and options are few. He laughs off danger, reassures you that it is all under control, while the walls themselves remember missing children. When his final night comes, his end is not framed as a heroic sacrifice, and it is not the poetic punishment of a villain finally caught. It is a panicked message cut short, a scream under mechanical noise, a quiet casualty of a system that never truly protected him, a man who trusted training manuals and company lines in a place that only ever protected its own legacy. So, for a moment, let the tale wash over you in a different way. Imagine that, instead of a riddle to decode, he is the co-worker whose voicemails you have been replaying for years, the colleague who trained you, whose jokes and warnings still echo in your ears long after he is gone. And as we move on step by step through the rest of this history, try holding him there, not as a mystery to solve, but as a tired employee who never knew how haunted his workplace really was. Why his story matters to the larger FNAF timeline. Held in that light, his story begins to do something very quiet and very important for the larger timeline. While names like William Afton and Henry Emily move the great machinery of this history, while their choices shape the tragedies and the restless spirits, Our Phone Guy lets us see what all of that looked like from the break room, from the cramped little office where someone just wanted to finish a shift and go home. He is not a mastermind, not a central architect of remnant experiments or grand designs, and that absence is exactly why his voice matters. Through him, we hear how corporate policies land on an ordinary employee, how a memo about safe rooms or temporary suits becomes a quiet dread in the back of a manager's mind, how the haunted shadows of Afton's crimes filter down as new rules, new posters, new training tapes. We feel the impact of genius and monstrosity on someone who is neither, just caught in the wake. His calls also give us something precious in a tangled web like this one. Time itself. When he mentions the new toy models and the bite of 87 in the second game, we can place that location on the timeline. When he talks about doors that no longer work, about power conservation, about the older, more unpredictable animatronics in the first game, we can feel the years that have passed. Each offhand reference to grand reopenings, to missing children, to daytime incidents, becomes a timestamp, a gentle marker that lets us drift, step by step, from one era of Fazbear history to another. Through his perspective, the horror stops being purely supernatural and becomes a workplace hazard. Instead of ancient curses, we hear about paychecks, about night shifts, about nothing to worry about, said one time too many. The animatronics are not only possessed machines, they are malfunction reports, safety complaints, and half-joking warnings about staying away from certain rooms after dark. In his hands, the dreamlike terror of FNAF turns into something you could almost imagine on a real schedule, pinned to a real bulletin board. As we follow him from the earlier days of the toy models, to his more weary tone in the first game, to the training tapes repurposed in the third, a through line appears. His life and then his death call, quietly stitched together multiple locations, policies and cover-ups into one continuous thread. We hear the optimism, the denial, the growing awareness, and finally the scream, and the entire history tightens around that single, fragile human presence. In the quiet hours of this story, understanding Phone Guy becomes a way of understanding what it meant to live inside Freddy Fazbear's legacy, to clock in beneath those smiling faces, to be reassured and then ignored, and then left alone with the consequences. As we move deeper into the timeline, let the tale wash over you with that in mind. Every incident we trace, every tragedy we map, once sat on someone's desk, waiting for a voice like his to explain it away. A slow walk back through the offices. Soft recap. So now, before we move forward again, we take a slow walk back through what we have already crossed, as if we are the last ones in the building at closing time, checking doors, turning off lights, letting the tale wash over you one more time in these quiet hours. We begin where the timeline does not, but where his voice first reached us. That cramped little toy location office in the second game. Bright posters on the walls, plastic masks, hanging like hollow faces above the desk. We can almost hear his first cheerful greeting again. That practiced warmth as he welcomes us to our new summer job, drifting slowly past the real dangers. He jokes about the quirky behavior of the animatronics, mentions the bite as if it were a regrettable but manageable incident, and we can feel the company line in every sentence, even as restless spirits move just beyond the camera feed. Step by step, we move down an invisible hallway in the timeline, and the decorations peel away. The toys and balloons fade, and we arrive at the original FNAF1 office, darker, more worn, fan humming, paper plates and tiny drawings pinned to the walls like echoes of innocent days. His calls here are different. The jokes are thinner, the pauses longer. He still tries to reassure us, still frames everything as routine. But each night his voice shifts a little, weighed down by the history we now know, sits behind those doors. Missing children, closed rooms, a tangled web of reports and warnings that never truly reached the light. We remember the way he recited the Springlock instructions, almost mechanically, as if reading from an aging manual no one wanted to admit still existed. Don't get them wet. Don't move too suddenly. Don't trust the suit when it smiles back. We hear his careful warnings about the safe room, that hidden space behind the walls, officially removed from the building's layout, but still very real in the haunted shadows of Fazbear's legacy. His tone there is softer, more cautious, as though he understands that some tragedies cannot be filed away. And then, that final interrupted message. In the FNAF1 office, the power flickers in our memory as we listen again. The hurried words, the forced optimism, the sudden intrusion of metallic footsteps and guttural sounds as something enters the room with him. The tape does not end cleanly. It is swallowed, mid-thought, by a scream and a crashing, and then by silence. Much later, we find ourselves in the dusty control room of Fazbear's Fright, monitors stacked like relics, charred walls holding the smoke-stained history of everything that came before. Here, his voice returns as training tapes, distant and archival, no longer speaking to us directly so much as drifting through the ruins, a reminder that his role continued even after his body did not. In this place, we move slowly, turning off each mental monitor one by one. The toy office, the first office, the safe room, the instruction manuals, the death call. As we leave each space behind, we do not solve every question. We simply acknowledge that his story, like so many in this series, is stitched from quiet tragedies and unanswered gaps. In the next part of our timeline, we will step away from his desk and follow the consequences that spilled out beyond it. But for now, we let the doors close gently behind us and allow his voice to fade into the background hum of the dream. Lingering questions, what we still don't know about Phone Guy. And as his voice fades into that background hum, we are left, almost inevitably, with the gentle weight of what we still do not know about him. We have followed his messages. We have listened to his warnings. But in the quiet hours after his last call, questions linger in the air like dust motes in the security office light. We never learn his real name. On every tape, in every game, he is simply Phone Guy, a role rather than a person, a presence rather than a full identity, and that absence creates its own quiet tragedy. Was he just a night guard promoted to training specialist, or something closer to a manager trying to keep the timeline of disasters under control, one new hire at a time? His exact job title is left in the shadows, somewhere between authority and expendable worker, and the company, as always, is careful not to clarify. We also never hear him say, outright, that he tried to quit. He complains, he jokes weakly about danger, he acknowledges the bite of 87 and the missing children, as if they are unfortunate incidents in a long corporate memo. But he never tells us whether he stood at the door one evening, keys in hand, and thought about simply not coming back. Did he stay because he needed the money, because he believed the official explanations, or because, on some level, he already felt trapped inside this tangled web of hauntings and liability waivers? And then there is the question of how much he truly understood. When he tells you calmly that the animatronics get a bit quirky at night, when his final FNAF1 call dissolves into distant banging, a distorted Freddy jingle, and that last strangled scream, we are left to wonder whether he knew he was speaking from within a building full of restless spirits, or whether he clung to the safer story of malfunctioning robots and bad wiring. The training tapes in FNAF3 hint that he recorded message after message for guards you never meet, yet even there, his certainty is incomplete. His explanations always one step behind the horror. In a way, this is exactly how Five Nights at Freddy's treats so many of its side characters. They drift in at the edges of the frame, half seen in haunted shadows and half heard through grainy recordings, inviting us to fill in the missing pieces ourselves. The series leaves them partially obscured, not out of carelessness, but as an invitation to imagine their families, their paychecks, their fears, to let the tale wash over you while your mind sketches the rest. Because if you think about it, many of us have known a co-worker like this, someone we only ever encountered through a voice on the phone, a name on a schedule, a note taped to a monitor. We might not know their middle name or where they went after they left the job, but we remember the way they sounded at 2 a.m. and the way they tried to make a bad situation feel manageable. The gaps in Phone Guy's history make him feel strangely real, like a person whose full story we were never entitled to hear. So we are allowed, gently, to keep our own favorite version of him. Perhaps, in your personal canon, he was naive but well-meaning, believing the company line until it was too late. Perhaps you prefer the theory that he knew far more, that every casual reassurance was a careful half-truth, meant to keep you in the chair just a little longer. The games do not insist that we choose one answer. They leave room for your own quiet interpretation. And as we continue drifting slowly through this history, we can carry those questions with us without needing them to resolve. On the next time you start a new file and hear his familiar greeting crackle through the speakers, when that cheerful "hello, hello" echoes out over the empty stage, you may find yourself listening differently, hearing not just a tutorial, but a man standing on the edge of his own fate and wondering softly what else he never had the chance to say. A final night shift. Together, easing towards sleep. So as we leave him there, with that unfinished sentence hanging in the air, the building around us is beginning its own quiet goodbye, and the long shift we've shared with him is easing toward its end. The monitors that once glared with harsh light are dimming now, their colors softening at the edges, as if even the cameras are finally tired of watching the same haunted shadows pace their nightly routes. One by one, how the animatronics settle. A last twitch of an ear, a servo's gentle whine, a flicker of eyes that were once so eager to find you in the dark, and then stillness, like a stage after closing when the audience has gone home and only dust motes drift in the spotlights. Somewhere in the back room, a tape deck clicks, the final recording of Phone Guy's instructions reaching its end, the tape wheel slowing, the sound thinning, and then stopping altogether. You do not have to hold on to every detail we have walked through tonight. The timeline, with all its quiet tragedies and restless spirits and corporate cover stories, is too wide to grasp in a single waking thought, and that is all right. You can let the tale wash over you, Let it sink quietly into the background, like the hum of a fan in an empty office, there but not demanding your attention. As you breathe in, imagine the cameras cycling through their last loop, and as you breathe out, picture the screens fading to black, one by one. In, the soft glow of the hall lights. Out, the power being gently switched off. We are drifting slowly with that rhythm now, step by step, breath by breath, matching the slow settling of this place as it moves from vigilance into rest. Phone Guy's journey for tonight is complete. We have followed his cheerful greetings and nervous laughter, his warnings about doors and lights and power usage, all the way to that final scream on night 4, and we have watched his legacy echo forward in training tapes and recycled messages. Outside this moment, the games will continue. Theories will twist this tangled web into new shapes, and fresh questions will be asked about who he was and what he knew. But here, in these quiet hours, his story can simply lie still beside you. If you find yourself returning to this office on another night, you will hear him again. The same crackle at the start of a shift. The same familiar cadence, equal parts comfort and unease. This video, this story, will be waiting in the dark like a muted monitor, ready to blink back to life, to keep you company while you drift at the edge of dream, and to stand one more night at the desk with you until sleep quietly takes over the watch. And for now, you do not need to do anything at all. Just listen to the silence after the tape stops. Feel the building grow still around you, and rest. Soft CTA, joining the night guard community, and as the building settles into that deeper stillness, and as the last echo of the tape winds down into memory, we can just linger here together for a moment, in these quiet hours between one story and the next. The monitor glow has dimmed. The fan hum has become a kind of lullaby, and all that remains is you, the shadows on the walls, and this long, haunted history we've been unfolding step by step. If you're still awake, and only if your eyes are not yet drifting slowly towards sleep, you might gently consider leaving a like on this video, or subscribing so you can find your way back to more of these slow, complete FNAF timelines. From the first experiments in Remnant to the mimic hiding in digital code. From Henry's grief to William's quiet tragedies, we will keep walking the same tangled web of events, always at this calm, measured pace, are always with the goal of making the restless spirits of this story feel a little more understandable, a little less sharp around the edges. There are so many overlooked figures waiting in the haunted shadows with Phone Guy. The night guards who came before and after him, the technicians in underground halls, the children whose names never made it to the headlines, even the corporate voices on training tapes that sound so ordinary, yet carry the weight of tragedy. Each of them can be followed through the timeline in this same sleep story style. Their lives and endings traced slowly and clearly, not to startle you awake, but to let the tale wash over you until the details blur into dream. When it's convenient, perhaps tomorrow or the next quiet night you spend with us, you might like to share your own theories about Phone Guy down in the comments. You can imagine it as a break room that exists outside of time, a little fluorescent lit corner where night guards from every location trade stories over cold coffee, comparing notes about who really made those training calls, which animatronic reached his office first, and what his legacy might be after the tape cuts to static. Your thoughts become part of that conversation, another file tucked into the growing archive of this haunted company's history, and you are not alone in that. All around the world, in different time zones and different bedrooms, people are listening to these same tales of pizzerias and missing posters and flickering cameras, all drifting slowly toward sleep with the same voices in their ears. Some are just beginning the timeline, and some are re-listening to favorite nights. Some are half awake, catching only fragments of Phone Guy's warnings as they slide into dream. Together, we make a quiet, unseen community of listeners, keeping each other company across the dark. But remember, none of this is required. You do not have to click anything. You do not have to type a single word. You do not have to stay awake to the end. Simply resting here, letting the story unwind in the background, is already more than enough. For now, you can release every thought of doing and return fully to the comfort of just being, as the watch continues without you and the night carries you gently onward. Good night, Phone Guy. Closing the office door. And so, as the watch goes on without us, we can let our attention drift to a smaller room within this larger tragedy, a little box of light tucked inside the haunted shadows of the pizzeria. It is quiet there now. The shift has ended. The cameras are dark. On the desk, the fan still turns, its blades moving slowly through the stale air, pushing papers that no one will read and rustling notes that no one will follow. The posters on the wall, bright and innocent in daylight, hang in the dimness like faded memories, their smiling characters frozen in a history they never chose. The monitor's glow has faded, leaving only its blank reflection, and beside it, the phone rests in its cradle, finally silent after so many restless nights of warning and reassurance. We can imagine, just for a moment, that this room is not a crime scene or a control booth, but an ordinary office at the edge of an ordinary job. The chair creaks, pushed back one last time, and a figure stands, stretches tired shoulders, and gathers nothing, because there is nothing here that belongs to him. In this gentle version of the story, Phone Guy steps out of that office and into the hallway, the door closing slowly behind him with a soft, final click, leaving behind only his recorded messages, sealed like little time capsules in the wires. Those messages will keep playing, long after his footsteps have faded. Night after night, game after game, they guide us through the quiet hours, from the cheerful welcome of night 1, to the fraying confidence of night 4, to the static and screams that mark his end in the game's tangled web of timelines. He has talked thousands of players through their first shift, through their first power outage, through their first encounter with animatronics that should not move. His voice has become part of gaming history, a familiar thread woven through remakes, sequels, and distant spin-offs. If you listen closely, drifting slowly between waking and dream, there is something strangely comforting about that. In a world built on jump scares and quiet tragedies, on missing children and restless spirits, he is not a monster, not a hero, not a meme, but a presence. Someone who shows up, who explains, who tries. We can offer him a quiet thank you for that. Not loudly, not ironically, but as a small acknowledgement that his legacy is to make the darkness a little more understandable. So we let the fan keep spinning in our minds. We let the posters fade back into the shadows, and we let the phone stay on its cradle at rest. The office door is closed. The pizzeria's lights are turning off, one room at a time. And perhaps, in your room as well, the screens can dim and the noise can soften. For tonight, we can let the tale wash over us, step by step, until the building and our thoughts grow quiet enough to sleep, while the larger timeline waits patiently for us to return. Drifting off with the dial tone. Final farewell. So now, as the last lights click off in that quiet office and the monitors cool into darkness, we can hear it again, very faintly, in the back of our minds. A thin dial tone, humming in the distance like the end of a long call that has finally reached its last word. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It just lingers there, drifting slowly at the edge of the quiet hours. A reminder that this voice we have followed through so many haunted shadows has, at last, been allowed to rest. We have walked with him through warnings and jokes, through half-truths and careful silences, through those quiet tragedies that shaped the history of Freddy Fazbear's. We have listened to his cheerful introductions on night 1, his strained reassurance on night 4, his final broken message as something heavy moved in the room behind him. Step by step, we traced the tangled web of his choices and his fears, until the man behind the phone felt less like a tutorial and more like a tired co-worker, doing his best to survive a legacy he could never fully control. Now, you do not have to hold all of that in your thoughts. It is all right to let the details blur, to let the specific dates and incidents slip gently out of focus, while the larger timeline keeps turning without you. The missing children, the bite of 87, the restless spirits in the walls, the mimic learning in the dark, all of it can keep unfolding in the background, like a story still being told in another room, while you lie here and simply breathe. If your mind tries to circle back to questions, you can let them pass like distant ringing on a phone you do not need to answer. Was he complicit, or only afraid? Did his voice linger in old training tapes, or in something less human? Those questions can wait. For tonight, the call is over. The handset is resting on its cradle. The line is quiet. When you next return to this universe, the story will still be here, waiting patiently. Phone Guy's path through this haunted history will be a little clearer. The human shape of his fear and his small attempts at kindness a little easier to see. And you might remember the way his tone shifted from confident to strained, the way his final message cracked, and you may find that, in the gentle distance of sleep, he feels less like a faceless employee and more like another innocent caught in the machinery. So we will say goodnight to him now, and to you as well. Thank you for letting the tale wash over you, for walking with us through these shadows until the edges softened and the danger became only a story told in a low, steady voice. The dial tone grows fainter. The building is still. The line goes silent, and the quiet remains, leaving just enough empty space for your breathing to slow, for your thoughts to loosen, and for sleep to pick up where the call left off.